The cardboard box sat on Jack Morrison's desk like an accusation. 35 years of architectural work reduced to personal effects that fit in 18 inches of corrugated material. A coffee mug with the firm's old logo, 3 mechanical pencils, a framed photo of a building he'd designed in 2003, back when people still wanted his vision, still believed that experience mattered more than software proficiency. The HR manager hovered in the doorway, young enough to be his daughter, sympathetic in the way people are when they're executing orders from above. "We appreciate everything you've contributed, Mr. Morrison. The severance package is quite generous." Generous. 6 months' salary for 35 years. The math didn't add up, but math rarely did when corporations decided you'd become too expensive, too old, too much a reminder that architecture used to be about beauty instead of billable hours. Jack placed the last item in the box, a spirit level his father had given him when he graduated from Illinois. Hand-carved walnut handle, brass fittings, the bubble still perfectly centered after 40 years. Jim Morrison had pressed it into his hands and said only this: "Stay true, even when everything around you isn't." He hadn't understood it then, wasn't sure he understood it now. The November rain turned Chicago streets into rivers of brake lights and regret. Jack drove to the condo in Lincoln Park, the one Carol had let him keep in the divorce because she'd already moved on, already found someone who came home before midnight and remembered anniversaries. The place felt like a museum of a life he'd stopped living. Furniture from their marriage, art they'd chosen together, empty rooms that echoed with the absence of the family he'd been too busy to keep. The whiskey was where he'd left it, tucked behind the books he'd bought but never read. He poured 3 fingers into a glass that had been a wedding gift and sat at the window overlooking the city he'd helped build. 17 buildings bore his mark, 17 towers of glass and steel that would outlast him. His sponsor's number sat in his phone under Steve. 12 years sober, and he could still feel the pull, still taste the burn, still remember the year after the divorce when drinking had been easier than feeling. He set the glass down untouched and called instead. "Jack, you okay?" "I got fired." "I'm sorry, man, you using?" "No, but I'm thinking about it." "Then talk to me instead." They talked until the rain stopped and the city lights blurred into impressionist painting of everything he'd achieved and everything it had cost. Steve didn't offer solutions, just presence. The same gift Jack had failed to give his own son for 30 years. When he hung up, the whiskey still sat there, amber and promising. Jack poured it down the sink and went to bed in a room that felt too large for one person and too small for the weight of 58 years of choices. The lawyer's call came 3 days later. Professional, efficient. The words arriving in that particular tone legal professionals use when delivering news that's going to complicate your life. "Mr. Morrison, I'm calling about your mother's estate, Evelyn Morrison. I'm sorry for your loss." Jack's hand froze on the coffee maker. His mother. Dead. The words didn't connect, didn't form meaning. He'd spoken to her 2 months ago. She'd been fine, healthy, living in the nursing home in Millfield, complaining about the food and the nurses and the fact that her son never visited. When? Last Thursday, peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was Saturday. Saturday, 5 days ago. His mother had been buried for 5 days and no one had thought to call him until the estate needed settling. "Why wasn't I notified?" "Your mother left instructions. She didn't want you contacted until after. Said you'd just make excuses anyway." The accuracy of it hurt more than the words themselves. "There's a property, the house in Millfield. She left it to you. You'll need to come sign the papers." Jack drove to Ohio on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray December day that makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. The route was familiar despite 40 years of avoiding it. Interstate 80 to 75, south through the flat farmland that had bored him as a child and seemed almost beautiful now in its absolute honesty about what it was. Millfield appeared exactly as he remembered, and nothing like it. The hardware store still anchored Main Street, but half the other shops wore plywood windows. The diner where he'd eaten breakfast every Sunday looked smaller, sadder, like it had been holding its breath for decades. The mill that had employed half the town sat abandoned, windows broken, parking lot returning to nature. The law office occupied the second floor above the bank, the same bank where his father had gotten the loan to build their house in 1965. The same bank that had probably foreclosed on a dozen properties since the mill closed. James Chen, the lawyer, looked too young to be handling estates, but then everyone looked young to Jack now. He spread papers across a desk that had probably been there since Eisenhower. The house and the 3 acres it sits on, free and clear. Your mother paid off the mortgage in 1987. Property taxes are current. The structure itself, he paused, choosing words carefully. It needs work. How much work? The kind that makes most people call a demolition company. They drove to the property in separate cars, Jack following the lawyer's sedan down streets he'd bicycled as a child. Past the elementary school, past Henderson's farm, past the Methodist church where he had been baptized and confirmed and married in a ceremony his father had attended, but not enjoyed because Jim Morrison had never trusted Carol's ambition. The house stood at the end of Morrison Road, a street named for his grandfather who'd farmed this land before the town existed. 3 acres of overgrown grass and volunteer trees, and in the center, the farmhouse that Jim Morrison had built the year Jack was born. It looked like it was dying. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing in patches that revealed tar paper weathered to the consistency of tissue. The porch listed to one side, boards rotted through in spots that you could see from the driveway. Paint that had once been white had faded to the color of old bones, peeling in strips that revealed wood gone gray with age and neglect. Jack sat in his truck and felt 40 years of distance collapse into this moment. The house his father built. The house where he'd learned to walk and ride a bike and throw a baseball. The house he'd left the day after high school graduation, heading to Chicago with promises to visit that he'd kept exactly never. The foundation is still solid, Chen offered, trying to find something positive. And the framing, your father built to last. They walked the perimeter. The basement windows were broken, filled with leaves and the nests of things that lived in abandoned places. The back door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The garden his mother had tended for 50 years had gone to weeds and wild roses that climbed the walls like they were trying to pull the house back into the earth. Inside was worse. Water damage in every room from the roof leaks. Plaster crumbling off walls in chunks that revealed the lath beneath. The kitchen was a museum piece from 1972. Avocado appliances and linoleum so cracked it looked like a topographical map. The bathroom toilet had fallen through the rotted subfloor, sitting at an angle that would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. But in the master bedroom, Jack found his father's workshop, the room where Jim Morrison had drafted building plans by hand, using the same mechanical pencils and T-square and parallel rule he'd learned on in trade school. The desk still stood against the window, covered in dust, but solid, and on it, a toolbox, walnut, hand-dovetailed. The same toolbox Jack remembered from childhood, the one his father would carry to job sites. The one that held every tool maintained to perfection because Jim Morrison believed that a craftsman's equipment was a measure of his character. Jack opened it with hands that shook slightly. Inside, nested in fitted compartments, the tools of his father's trade. Chisels with hornbeam handles, a block plane that could shave wood to translucence, a combination square that had belonged to Jack's grandfather. A spirit level from 1947, its bubble still centered and true. And at the bottom, folded into careful quarters, a note in his father's distinctive hand. For Jack, when he's ready. Dad, 1998. 15 years before Jim Morrison died of pancreatic cancer in this house, in the bedroom next to his workshop, alone because his son was too busy with a project in Denver to come home. Jack sat on the dusty floor and read the note 3 times, looking for meaning in the date, in the words, in the fact that his father had believed, even then, that someday Jack would come back, would be ready, would understand whatever it was Jim had been trying to teach him for 58 years. Mr. Morrison? Chen stood in the doorway. I need to get back to the office. Do you want to sign the papers? What's the property worth? As is? Maybe $5,000. The land has some value, but you'd have to demolish the house. Cost of demo would eat most of that. $5,000. Less than Jack spent on car insurance. Less than a month's rent on the Lincoln Park condo. The same amount his father had probably spent on materials to build this place in 1965, working nights and weekends for 3 years because he couldn't afford a construction crew. I'll sign. They returned to the office. Jack put his name on documents that transferred ownership of his father's dream from the dead to the barely living. Chen offered condolences and contact information and the keys to a house that probably wasn't worth the metal they were stamped from. Jack drove back to the property alone, sat in the truck as the sun set and the temperature dropped and his breath fogged the windshield. He should drive back to Chicago, put the house on the market, take the $5,000 and add it to the severance, and figure out what 58-year-old unemployed architects do with the rest of their lives. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number he hadn't called in 3 years. His thumb hovered over the name. Tommy Morrison, his son, 29 years old and a stranger because Jack had been too busy designing buildings for other people's families to notice his own falling apart. The call went to voicemail. Tommy's voice, terse and professional. "Leave a message. It's your father. I'm in Millfield, at Grandpa's house. I need help with something. I'll pay you. Call me back." He hung up feeling like he'd just jumped off a cliff with no idea if there was water below or just rocks. The motel on Route 40 had seen better decades. Jack checked into a room that smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner, lay on a bed that sagged in the middle, and stared at the ceiling tiles that were probably older than his marriage. His phone rang at 10. "Tommy, what do you want?" Not hello, not how are you. Just the question, sharp and guarded, the tone of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to waste energy on pleasantries. "I inherited Grandpa's house. It needs work, a lot of work. I thought maybe you could help. You're a contractor." "I'm busy. I'll pay you, whatever your rate is." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Jack thought maybe Tommy had hung up. Then, why? "Because I can't do it alone." "No, why now? Why after 3 years of nothing do you suddenly need me?" Jack could lie, could say something about timing or opportunity, or finally having the space to tackle a project. But he'd promised himself in the HR office, standing over that cardboard box, that he was done lying to make things easier. "Because I'm 58 and unemployed and divorced, and I just realized I've spent my entire life building things for strangers while everything I should have cared about fell apart. And this house is the last thing my father left me, and I don't want to fail at this too." The honesty surprised them both. "I'm getting divorced," Tommy said finally. "I've got a 6-year-old daughter I barely see because I work too much. I'm broke. I'm behind on my contractor's license renewals. And the last thing I need is to help the father who taught me how to abandon my family by being really good at it himself." Each word landed like a hammer. True, deserved, devastating. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I'm asking anyway. What's in it for me?" 50-50 split on whatever we can sell it for, plus daily rate while we work. "The house is worth $5,000. You said it yourself. Even if we put $50,000 into it, which neither of us have, we'd be lucky to sell it for $60 in this market. The math doesn't work." "I know. So why are you doing this?" Jack looked at his reflection in the motel room mirror. 58 years old, gray stubble, eyes that looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Because it's the last thing my father asked me to do, even if he asked 15 years too late." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "I'll come look at it, but I'm not promising anything. That's all I'm asking." They met at the house the next morning. Tommy arrived in a truck that had seen better years, tools rattling in the bed, wearing Carhartt coveralls stained with the evidence of 1,000 jobs. He'd inherited Jim Morrison's build, tall and broad-shouldered, built for the kind of labor that Jack's generation had tried to engineer out of existence. He'd also inherited Jack's eyes, blue-gray and assessing, taking in the house with the professional distance of someone who knew exactly how bad it was. They didn't shake hands, didn't hug, just stood in the cold December morning. Two men who shared blood and bone structure and almost nothing else. "Show me," Tommy said. They walked the property. Jack pointed out the obvious problems. Tommy found a dozen more, pulling back siding to reveal rot, testing boards that crumbled under pressure, making notes on his phone with the efficiency of someone who'd done this assessment 100 times. In the basement, Tommy knelt by the foundation, running his hand along concrete that Jim Morrison had poured himself in 1965. "This part's solid. He used the right ratio, probably mixed it himself. The footer goes down 4 feet below the frost line. This'll outlast everything else." It was the first time Jack had heard his son speak about his grandfather without anger, and it felt like a door opening slightly. They spent 4 hours going through every room, every system, every inch of a house that was trying very hard to fall down. When they finished, Tommy sat on the porch steps and pulled out his phone calculator. Foundation is good. Framing is mostly good. Some sistering needed on the floor joists, but the roof needs to be completely replaced. All the plumbing, all the electrical, every window, new furnace, new water heater, insulation, drywall, flooring, kitchen, bathrooms, probably 70,000 in materials and labor if we hire it out. Maybe 35 if we do most of it ourselves. "I've got 12,000 in savings. The severance will cover maybe 6 months of living expenses if I'm careful. So we're 30,000 short with no income and no way to get a loan against a property that's worth less than what we'd owe. Yeah, Tommy stood, brushed dust from his coveralls. This is a terrible idea. I know. We're going to fail. Probably. And you still want to do it? Jack looked at the house that his father built, that his mother maintained, that had stood for 60 years waiting for someone to care about it again. Looked at his son, standing in the same spot where Jim Morrison used to stand, looking at the world with the same assessing gaze. Yeah, I do. Tommy walked to his truck, and Jack felt the familiar weight of rejection settling on his shoulders. Then Tommy opened the bed, pulled out a pry bar and a sledgehammer, and carried them to the porch. Then we better get started. Daylight's burning. They worked in silence for the first 2 hours. Tommy on the exterior, ripping out rotted porch boards with the controlled violence of someone working through deeper issues. Jack on the interior, pulling up carpets so old it had probably witnessed the Ford administration. The only communication came through the walls, the percussion of Tommy's hammer, the whine of Jack's circular saw. Father and son, separated by plaster and 40 years of bad decisions, doing the only thing they knew how to do: work. By noon, they'd filled a construction dumpster that Tommy had ordered without asking, charged to a credit card that probably couldn't afford it. They sat on the tailgate of Tommy's truck, eating sandwiches from the gas station, not talking because talking required acknowledging that this was happening, that they were actually doing this impossible thing. Mia asked about you, Tommy said finally. Jack's granddaughter, 6 years old. A child he'd met exactly once at Tommy's wedding, back when Carol still believed Jack might change. What did you tell her? That I had a father, but we didn't talk much. She said that was sad and I should fix it. Smart kid. Smarter than both of us combined. They ate in silence for a few more minutes. Then Tommy crumpled his sandwich wrapper and looked at Jack directly. I need to know something. Why did you leave? Not just the house, all of it. This town, Grandpa, me. Jack had spent 40 years avoiding this question. Had a dozen practiced answers about ambition and opportunity and the need to make something of himself. But none of them were true, and sitting on this truck in the shadow of his father's dying house, lies felt like a weight he couldn't carry anymore. Because I was terrified of becoming him, your grandfather. Spending my whole life in a small town, building houses for people who couldn't afford to pay much, dying with nothing but some tools in a house that would probably outlast any legacy I could leave. I wanted more. I wanted to matter. I wanted to design buildings that would make people stop and stare and remember my name. Did you? 17 buildings, 12 still standing, all of them with someone else's name on the door. And was it worth it? Jack looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw Jim Morrison staring back. The same stubborn jaw, the same capable hands, the same understanding that work done with care was a form of dignity. No, it wasn't. Tommy nodded like this was the answer he'd expected. Grandpa used to talk about you when I was a kid, said you were going to be somebody. Design important buildings, change skylines. He was proud of you even though you never called, never visited, never acted like he mattered. He told you that? No, Grandma did after he died. Said he'd wait by the phone every Sunday evening, hoping you'd call. And when you didn't, he'd make excuses. Say you were busy. Say you had important work. Say he understood, even though it was killing him, that his son couldn't spare 10 minutes to talk to the man who'd spent 3 years building him a childhood. The words hit harder than any hammer. Jack set down his sandwich, suddenly unable to eat. I didn't know? Yeah, that's the problem. You didn't know because you didn't ask, didn't visit, didn't care enough to find out what not caring cost. They sat in silence as the December sun tracked across the sky, weak and watery, and offering no warmth. 2 men, 2 generations, both paying the price for lessons they'd learned from the same source. Finally, Jack spoke. I can't give you back the years I wasted. Can't undo the damage. Can't make excuses that would matter. But I can show up now, I can try, if you'll let me. Tommy was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, grabbed his tools, and headed back to the porch. We're burning daylight, and this house isn't going to fix itself. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't even acceptance. But it was a start. They worked until dark, until Jack's back screamed and Tommy's hands were raw despite his gloves. They'd accomplished maybe 2% of what needed doing, had uncovered 3 new problems for everyone they'd solved, and were no closer to having an actual plan than when they'd started. But they'd work together. And sometimes, Jack thought as he drove back to the motel, sometimes that's enough. His phone buzzed as he was falling asleep. A text from Tommy. Same time tomorrow? Jack typed back with hands that could barely hold the phone. Yeah, same time. He lay in the dark of a motel room in a town he'd spent 40 years running from and felt something that might have been hope. Small, fragile, probably doomed to fail. But present, finally impossibly present. The house stood in the darkness, half demolished and half standing, waiting for two broken men to come back in the morning and continue the work of making broken things whole. The same work that had been waiting for Jack Morrison his entire life. The same work he was finally, maybe, ready to begin. The third week arrived with the kind of morning that makes a man forget winter ever existed. Jack Morrison stood in the driveway of his father's farmhouse, coffee steam rising into air so clear it hurt to breathe. 58 years on this planet, and he still couldn't get used to Ohio silence. Not like Chicago, where sirens and car horns formed a constant soundtrack to failure. Here, the only sound was a cardinal arguing with its reflection in his truck's side mirror. His phone buzzed. Tommy. The text read, "Running late, Mia had nightmare, be there by 9. Jack stared at those 11 words longer than necessary. Mia, 6 years old, his granddaughter, a child he'd met exactly once, at Tommy's wedding 8 years ago, back when Carol still believed Jack might change, back when Tommy still invited him to things. The memory arrived unwanted, himself in the church parking lot, checking work emails during the ceremony, missing his own son say I do because a client in Singapore had a question about load-bearing specifications. He deleted the message without responding and walked toward the house. The farmhouse looked worse in good light. Morning sun revealed every sin, every year of neglect, every broken promise. The roof sagged like an old man's spine. Paint peeled in long strips, exposing wood gone gray with age and rain. The front porch listed to starboard, its boards soft enough to push a thumb through. His father had built this place in 1965, the year Jack turned 1. Jim Morrison had framed every wall, driven every nail, mixed every batch of concrete by hand, and Jack had let it rot. He circled the perimeter, making notes on a yellow pad that had somehow survived 3 decades of job sites. Foundation cracks on the north side, worse than he'd thought. The basement window wells filled with standing water, rust bleeding down the concrete like old wounds. A family of mice had converted the kitchen soffit into a condominium complex. He could hear them scratching above the sink where his mother used to wash dishes and hum songs she'd learned as a girl in Kentucky. The toolbox sat where he'd left it the night before, in what used to be the living room, his father's toolbox. Jack knelt beside it now, running his fingers over the latches. Brass, tarnished almost black. The box itself was walnut, hand-dovetailed at the corners because Jim Morrison didn't believe in shortcuts. The wood had darkened with age and oil from 2 generations of hands. Inside, the tools lay nested in their fitted compartments. A Stanley block plane, its irons sharp enough to shave with. A set of chisels with hornbeam handles, each one bearing the tiny initials JM carved near the ferrule. A combination square that had been his grandfather's. A spirit level made in 1947, its bubble still true. And at the very bottom, folded into quarters, the note he'd found his first day back. His father's handwriting, still strong despite the cancer that had been eating him alive. For Jack, when he's ready. Dad, 1998. 15 years before Jim Morrison died. 13 years before Jack bothered to come back. He was still holding the note when Tommy's truck rumbled up the driveway, diesel engine loud enough to wake the dead. Jack folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket, right over his heart, which felt both sentimental and pathetic. He was becoming the kind of old man who kept scraps of paper in his pockets. Tommy climbed out, looking like he'd slept in his clothes, which he probably had. Work boots untied, Carhartt jacket stained with something that might have been breakfast. He didn't meet Jack's eyes, just grabbed his tool belt from the truck bed and headed for the house. They worked in silence for the first 2 hours. Tommy outside, Jack in. The only communication came through the walls, the percussion of Tommy's hammer driving new decking nails, the whine of Jack's circular saw cutting out rot. Father and son, separated by 2 inches of plaster and 40 years of bad decisions. By noon, the November sun had warmed the air enough that Jack could work without his jacket. He was in the master bedroom, the room where his father had died, pulling up carpet so old it had probably witnessed the Nixon administration. Beneath it, the original oak flooring, water-stained and buckled, but salvageable. Everything in this house was salvageable if you cared enough to try. His phone rang. Carol. He almost didn't answer, but 3 years of therapy had taught him that avoidance was just cowardice in a nice suit. Hey, hey yourself. Her voice carried that particular warmth she reserved for when she was about to tell him something he didn't want to hear. Tommy called me this morning. Jack said nothing, just wedged the pry bar under another strip of tack board. He said, "You two aren't talking." "We're talking. Jack, we communicate about the work. That's talking." Carol's sigh traveled through the phone like weather. "You know what I mean." He did. Of course he did. Carol had always possessed an inconvenient talent for knowing exactly what he meant, what he felt, what he was avoiding. It was one of the things that made him fall in love with her and one of the things that made their marriage impossible. You can't hide from someone who sees through walls. "He's angry," Jack said finally. "He has a right to be. He's scared." That stopped him. Jack straightened, feeling his lower back protest. 58 years old, and his body kept a detailed record of every mistake. "Scared of what?" "Of turning into you." The words landed like a hammer between his ribs. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I should let you go. Got work to do." "Jack, wait, I didn't mean..." But he'd already hung up, because he was still, at his core, a coward. He stood in his father's bedroom, surrounded by debris and dust and the ghosts of better men, and felt the full weight of 58 years pressed down on his shoulders. Through the window, he could see Tommy on the porch, ripping out rotten boards with a violence that had nothing to do with carpentry and everything to do with rage. The old Tommy, the 8-year-old who used to wait by the window on Saturdays, hoping this would be the weekend Dad came home from the job site before dark. The teenage Tommy who stopped asking Jack to come to baseball games because the rejection hurt worse than the absence. The adult Tommy whose wedding Jack had attended in body while his mind remained at a construction site 3 states away. Tommy was scared of turning into him. Jesus Christ! Tommy was already turning into him. Jack walked outside without deciding to, his feet carrying him toward a conversation he had no idea how to have. Tommy saw him coming and tensed, hammer frozen mid-swing. "What?" "Not a question. A wall." Jack climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before trusting his weight. "This decking, you're using treated pine?" "Yeah, why?" "Your grandfather used cypress. It's in his notes. More expensive, but it'll outlast us both." Tommy's jaw worked. "We don't have the budget for cypress. I'll cover the difference." We agreed, split everything 50-50. "Tommy, I don't need your money, Jack." The way Tommy said his name, not Dad, not father, just Jack, like he was a stranger. Which he was, really. "I need you to let me do the job I said I'd do." Jack looked at his son, really looked at him. When had Tommy gotten so much gray in his beard? When had the lines appeared around his eyes? 29 years old and already carrying the weight of a much older man, working himself to exhaustion. Distant from his daughter, making the same mistakes in the same sequence. "Your mother called," Jack said. "I know. She said you're scared." Tommy's laugh came out sharp enough to cut. "Carol's got a theory for everything. She's usually right." "Yeah, well." Tommy turned back to his work, prying up another board with unnecessary force. "Even a stop clock gets it right twice a day." They stood there in the November sun, 2 men who shared blood and bone structure and the same congenital inability to say what they meant. A crow called from the oak tree in the front yard, the same oak that had been a sapling when Jack was born. His father had planted it the day Jack came home from the hospital. Another thing Jim Morrison had built to last. "I found your grandfather's plans," Jack said quietly. "For the restoration. He'd been working on them." That got Tommy's attention. When? Before he died. Years before. He knew the house was failing. He had ideas. Good ones. Some of them. Jack pulled the folded papers from his back pocket. Jim's careful architectural sketches rendered in pencil and hope. Some of them only work if 2 people collaborate. One person can't do it alone. Tommy took the papers like they might burn him. His eyes scanned the drawings, Jim Morrison's distinctive hand lettering labeling each detail. In the margin a note. "Jack will know the math for this beam span. Smart boy, my son. Too smart for his own good sometimes." Tommy read it twice. Then he refolded the papers carefully, precisely, the way their father had taught them to fold anything that mattered. "Okay," he said. "Just that, okay." They worked together for the first time that afternoon, wrestling a 16-foot beam into place across the living room ceiling. The job required 4 hands, 2 backs, and the kind of synchronization that only comes from trust or desperation. Jack took the high end, Tommy the low, and they lifted in unison, years of separate experience combining into something that looked almost like teamwork. The beam was white oak, reclaimed from a barn demolition 3 counties over. It weighed close to 300 pounds and did not want to cooperate. Jack's arms shook with the effort. His back screamed. Sweat ran into his eyes despite the November cold. "Little higher on your end," Tommy grunted. Jack adjusted, muscle memory from 40 years of job sites taking over. "How's that?" "Good. Hold steady." Tommy climbed the ladder, socket wrench in hand, and began threading the lag bolts that would lock the beam to the support posts. Each turn of the wrench brought them closer to something permanent. Each bolt represented a promise. This will hold, this will last, this matters. When the final bolt seated home, both men stepped back and looked at what they'd built. A single beam? Yes, but the first structural repair the house had seen in 20 years. The first step toward making good on a dead man's faith. "He would have done it different," Tommy said. "Yeah, he would have done it better." "I didn't mean, I know what you meant." Jack pulled 2 bottles of water from the cooler, tossed one to Tommy. They drank in silence, standing in the center of the room where 3 generations of Morrisons had celebrated Christmas, argued politics, and tried to figure out how to be men. Tommy finished his water and crushed the bottle slowly. "I'm getting divorced." The words arrived without preamble, without emotion, like he was reporting the weather. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Sarah?" "Yeah, papers are drafted, just waiting to file." "Tommy, Don't." Tommy's voice went hard. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say it'll be okay. Don't give me the divorced dad speech. Because you know what? You wrote the goddamn manual." And there it was, the truth, delivered with surgical precision. Jack sat down on a sawhorse, suddenly too tired to stand. "What happened?" "What always happens. I worked too much, came home too tired, forgot too many school plays, missed too many bedtimes." Tommy's voice cracked on the last word. "She said I love my work more than my family. And the fucked up thing, she's not wrong." The confession hung in the dusty air between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frames that needed replacing. Somewhere in the walls, the mice went about their business, building homes in the ruins of someone else's dream. "How's Mia handling it?" Jack asked. "She's 6. She thinks it's her fault. Because that's what kids do. They take the blame for their parents' failures." Tommy looked directly at Jack for the first time all day. "Sound familiar?" It did. God help him, it did. Jack had spent 30 years believing his father didn't care. That Jim Morrison loved carpentry more than his son, that work always came first. Only now, sitting in the house his father built, reading the plans his father drafted, touching the tools his father preserved, did Jack understand the truth. Jim Morrison hadn't chosen work over family. He'd chosen to build something that would outlast him, something his son could touch and know. "I was here. I mattered. I made something beautiful." And Jack had walked away from all of it, rejected the gift, and then spent 3 decades repeating the pattern with his own son. "You're not me," Jack said quietly. "Aren't I? Tell me how I'm different. Tell me one meaningful way I'm different." Jack wanted to argue, to list the ways Tommy was better, smarter, more present. But the truth sat between them like a third person, unwelcome and undeniable. "You're here," Jack said finally. "You showed up. That's more than I did at your age. I'm here because I need the money. Let's not make it noble. You brought Mia to meet me." That landed. Tommy's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering across his face before the armor went back up. "She asked about you. I told her I had a father, but we didn't talk. She said that was sad, and I should fix it." Tommy laughed bitter. 6 years old, and she's smarter than both of us combined. The sun was setting now, painting the walls gold through windows that needed new glass. Jack stood, his knees protesting, and walked to the toolbox. He pulled out the block plane, his father's favorite, and held it up to the fading light. "Your grandfather taught me to use this when I was 12. We spent a whole summer restoring a dining table someone threw away. Every day after school, 2 hours, just him and me and this plane. He'd show me how to read the grain, how to let the tool do the work, how to know when something was right by the feel of it in your hands." Tommy watched, wary, unsure where this was going. I thought he was teaching me carpentry, Jack continued, but he was teaching me patience, attention, how to take something broken and make it whole. And I was too stupid to understand until it was too late to thank him. He held the plane out to Tommy. I can't give you back the years I wasted. I can't unmiss the baseball games or the school plays or the birthdays, but I can teach you what he taught me if you want to learn. Tommy stared at the tool like it might bite him. Why now? Why does it suddenly matter? Because I'm running out of time, Jack said simply. And so are you. And your daughter deserves better than 2 more generations of Morrison men who don't know how to show up. The silence stretched. Outside, the last light bled from the sky, leaving them in shadows. Tommy reached out slowly and took the plane. The next morning, Jack woke before dawn to the sound of a truck in the driveway. He pulled on yesterday's jeans and stumbled outside to find Tommy unloading cypress planks, each one stamped with the supplier's mark. Got a deal, Tommy said, not looking up. Guy owed me a favor. It was a lie. Jack knew it was a lie. Tommy knew he knew. But sometimes lies are just love in a language men can speak. They worked side by side that day, and the day after, and the day after that. Slowly, carefully, they began to establish a rhythm. Jack would measure twice. Tommy would cut once. They'd lift together, level together, secure together. When they disagreed about an approach, which was often, they'd consult Jim's plans, let a dead man arbitrate disputes between the living. On Friday, Tommy brought Mia. Jack heard her before he saw her, a high, bright voice calling out questions faster than Tommy could answer them. What's that? Why's the house old? Can I help? Do you have snacks? Why don't you have snacks? She burst through the front door like a small tornado in pink sneakers, all energy and impossible optimism. She stopped when she saw Jack, sudden shyness replacing the questions. This is your grandpa, Tommy said, his hand on her shoulder. Remember? We met him at the lawyer's office. Mia studied Jack with the unsettling directness of children who haven't learned to hide their thoughts. You're taller than I remember. You're smarter than I remember, Jack replied. She considered this, decided it was acceptable, and smiled. Daddy says you're fixing the house his grandpa built. That's right. Can I see? Jack glanced at Tommy, who shrugged. Permission granted. He led Mia through the rooms, explaining what they'd done, what came next, what it would look like when they finished. She listened with the kind of attention adults rarely gave, asking questions that revealed a mind already thinking 3 steps ahead. When they reached the beam they'd installed together, Jack stopped. You see this? Mia nodded, looking up at the massive piece of oak. Your daddy and I put this here. It holds up the whole ceiling. It'll be here long after we're gone. Maybe your kids will touch this someday and wonder who built it. Will you write your names on it? Mia asked. So they know? Jack and Tommy locked eyes across the room. In that moment, they both saw it, the thread connecting past to future, grandfather to son to granddaughter. The way everything Jim Morrison built had led to this, 2 broken men trying to fix more than just a house. Yeah, Tommy said softly. Yeah, we'll write our names. They found a pencil, and there in the center of the beam, Tommy wrote, Jim Morrison, builder. Jack Morrison, architect. Tommy Morrison, carpenter, restored 2024. Then he held the pencil out to Mia. You helped too. You should sign. She printed her name in careful block letters, tongue between her teeth in concentration. M.I.A. Morrison. 4 generations. 1 beam, a promise written in graphite and faith. That night, after Tommy took Mia home, Jack sat on the porch and called Carol. Hey, he said when she answered. Hey yourself. You were right. About Tommy, about me, about all of it. Carol was quiet for a moment. That must have hurt to say, like pulling teeth. She laughed, and the sound carried him back 30 years, to when her laughter was the first thing he heard in the morning and the last thing before sleep. Before the jobs got bigger, and the hours got longer, and the distance between them grew too wide to cross. How is he, she asked. Scared, angry, getting divorced, turning into me. Jack paused. We're working on it. And you? Also scared, also angry, trying not to die before I fix what I broke. Jack Morrison, admitting he's scared. Did you fall and hit your head? Multiple times. The house is trying to kill me. The house or yourself? Always too smart, Carol. Always seeing through walls. Both, he admitted. They talked until the battery on his phone hit 10%, covering everything and nothing, the way old married couples do even after they're not married anymore. When he finally said goodbye, Carol's last words were, I'm proud of you for trying. 3 weeks into the project, Earl Patterson showed up. Jack was replacing rotted sill plates when he heard footsteps on the porch, heavier and slower than Tommy's. He emerged from the crawl space covered in cobwebs and dirt to find an old man studying the foundation repairs with a professional eye. Earl Patterson looked like he'd been carved from the same oak as the trees around him. 72 years old, but strong as bridge cable, wearing Dickies that had probably been purchased during the Carter administration. His face was a roadmap of sun damage and squint lines, the kind of face you only get from 50 years of outdoor work. "Jack Morrison," Earl said, not a question. "Mr. Patterson." "Earl, your daddy never called me mister, and I'm too old to start now." He knelt, surprisingly nimble, and ran his hand along the new concrete. "Using his mix ratio. Bet you found it in his notes. You helped him build this place. Every nail, every board. Summer of '65. Hottest goddamn summer on record. And your daddy insisted on doing it right. No shortcuts. We must have redone that foundation 3 times before he was satisfied." Earl stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "He talked about you constantly. Told everyone his boy was going to be a fancy architect in the city, design buildings that'd make people stop and stare." The words hit harder than Jack expected. "He said that?" "Every chance he got. Was so proud when you got into that school in Chicago. Told me he didn't understand half of what you were learning, but he knew it was important." Earl's eyes, sharp despite the years, studied Jack's face. "He also told me you stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped everything except sending money at Christmas." "I was busy." "Yeah, busy." Earl made the word sound like a curse. "Your daddy was dying for 3 years. You know how many times you came to see him?" Jack knew. The number lived in his chest like a stone. Twice. Twice. Once when he got diagnosed. Once for the funeral. 3 years of dying, and twice you managed to drive 4 hours to see the man who built you a childhood. Earl's voice stayed level, matter of fact. Somehow that made it worse. "He made excuses for you. Said you had important work. Said he understood. But I watched him sit by that phone every Sunday evening, waiting for a call that never came." The truth of it, delivered without mercy, drove the air from Jack's lungs. "Why are you telling me this?" he managed. "Because I liked your daddy, and I like this house, and I can see you're trying to make amends with your boy before you end up in the same box as Jim." Earl pointed at the foundation. "But you should know something. Your daddy started these renovation plans the day you stopped calling. He spent 15 years drawing blueprints for a restoration he knew he'd never see. You know why?" "No." Jack shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Because he believed you'd come back. He believed that someday, when you were ready, you'd walk through that door and see what he saw, a house worth saving, a legacy worth preserving. He believed in you long after you stopped believing in yourself." Earl headed for his truck, then paused. "Don't make Tommy wait 15 years to find out his daddy gave a damn." Earl drove away, leaving Jack standing in his father's driveway, holding the weight of 15 years of silence. That evening, when Tommy arrived, Jack was at the kitchen table with all of Jim's plans spread out before him. Dozens of drawings, hundreds of notes, a complete vision for returning the house to glory. And in the margins, everywhere, little messages clearly meant for Jack. "Jack will know the proper joist spacing here. This is where Jack's room was, windows face east, the way he always liked morning sun. Jack's mother chose this tile pattern. He might want to keep it." Tommy stood in the doorway, reading over Jack's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. "He never gave up on you. I didn't deserve that kind of faith." "No," Tommy agreed. "You didn't." They sat in silence as night fell outside. 2 men surrounded by the blueprints of a better future, drawn by a dead man who understood that love isn't what you say. It's what you build, what you leave behind, what you believe is possible, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. Finally, Jack spoke. "I need to tell you something." Tommy waited. "When I was 30, your age, I was working 80-hour weeks, trying to make partner at the firm, trying to prove I was more than just some farmer's kid from Ohio. Your mother was pregnant with you, and I missed the ultrasound where we found out you were a boy. Missed it because I was in a meeting that didn't matter with a client I can't even remember now." Jack picked up one of his father's drawings, a careful rendering of the front porch restored to perfection. "Carol asked me what mattered more, the jar or the family, and I said both. I said I could do both. But that was a lie, and we both knew it. You can't serve 2 masters. Can't build 2 legacies. You have to choose." "And you chose work," Tommy said. And I chose work, Jack confirmed. Every time, every choice, every moment. I chose wrong, and by the time I realized it, you were 18 and leaving for college, and I'd missed everything that mattered. Your first steps, your first words, every birthday, every Christmas, every moment that makes up a life. He looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the man Tommy had become despite Jack's absence, not because of his presence. You asked me how you're different in, Jack said. Here's how. You're asking the question. At 30, I didn't even know there was a choice to make. You do. You can still choose different. You can still the father I never was. Tommy's eyes were wet. He didn't bother hiding it. What if I can't? What if I'm too much like you? Then we'll fix that too, Jack said. One board at a time, one day at a time, however long it takes. They sat together until the dark was complete, making plans for a house, for a future, for a way forward that didn't repeat the sins of the past. And when they finally stood to leave, Tommy grabbed his father's shoulder. Just that, a hand on his shoulder, but it was enough. It was a start. The fourth week brought the first real test of their partnership. The electrical system, original to 1965, needed complete replacement. Jack wanted to hire a licensed electrician. Tommy wanted to do it themselves, save the money. They stood in the basement, looking at wiring that predated safety codes by a decade, and argued with the kind of intensity that comes from caring too much. This isn't trim work, Jack said. This is life safety. We screw this up, the house burns down. We won't screw it up. I've done residential wiring. I know what I'm doing. On new construction, this is different. This is you not trusting me, Tommy cut in. Like always. That's not fair, isn't it? Your whole life, you never thought I was good enough. Not good enough at school, not good enough at sports, not good enough to follow in your footsteps. Why would wiring be different? The accusation landed like a fist. Jack opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped. Because maybe Tommy was right. Maybe Jack had spent so long being disappointed in himself that he'd projected that disappointment onto his son. Maybe every criticism, every correction, every time he'd said, "Let me do it," instead of "let me show you," he'd been saying, "You're not enough." "You're right," Jack said quietly. Tommy blinked. "What?" "You're right. I didn't trust you. I didn't trust anyone, including myself, especially myself." Jack sat down on the basement stairs, suddenly exhausted. "But I'm trying to change that. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to pull the permits, source the materials, and run the new circuits. And I'm going to help, not lead, not take over. Help." Tommy stared at him like he'd started speaking Portuguese. "I know it's new," Jack said, "for both of us. But your grandfather's plans include detailed electrical schematics. He designed them for two people to execute together. So that's what we'll do." They spent the next 10 days snaking wire through walls that hadn't been opened since Kennedy was president. It was slow, frustrating work that required coordination and trust. Tommy would feed the wire from the basement while Jack pulled it through to the attic. They'd meet in the middle, splice connections, and test circuits until every switch worked exactly as it should. And slowly, in the spaces between measurements and wire nuts, they began to talk. Real talk, not about work or weather or safe topics, but about the things that mattered. Tommy told Jack about his marriage falling apart, about the fights and silences and slow erosion of something that had once been good. Jack told Tommy about his drinking, about the year after the divorce when he'd wake up not remembering how he got home, about rock bottom and AA and the slow climb back to something like functional. On the 11th day they finished. Every outlet, every switch, every light fixture exactly where it should be. They stood in the circuit panel room and Tommy threw the main breaker. Lights flooded the house for the first time in 20 years. They walked through each room, flipping switches, watching spaces transform from dark to bright. In the kitchen, overhead fixtures illuminated the new cabinets they'd installed. In the living room, the chandelier that had hung since 1968 blazed to life. In his father's bedroom, track lighting revealed the refinished oak floors. Everything worked. Everything was right. Everything was safe. Tommy turned to Jack, and his smile was the first genuine one Jack had seen in years. "We did it." "Yeah," Jack said, "we did." They stood in the master bedroom, surrounded by light, and for the first time since arriving at the house, Jack felt something that might have been hope. Maybe the house could be saved. Maybe the relationship could be saved. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. Outside, November was giving way to December. The trees had gone bare, the fields brown, the sky that particular gray that promises snow. Inside, heat circulated through new ductwork. Walls were sealed, windows no longer leaked. The house was becoming whole. And so, perhaps, were they. On the last Friday of November, Carol showed up unannounced. Jack was in the front yard raking leaves that had accumulated against the foundation when her Subaru pulled into the driveway. She emerged looking exactly like herself, which is to say beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or effort and everything to do with being fully present in her own skin. 56 years old and still the most genuine person he'd ever known. "Heard you needed an intervention," she said by way of greeting. "From who?" "Tommy. Said you two are living on gas station coffee in spite." "That's not entirely inaccurate." She grabbed grocery bags from her back seat. "Well, that ends today. You're going to eat real food, drink real coffee, and tell me how this is really going." They sat at the card table that served as their kitchen, eating sandwiches Carol had made, with the kind of care that suggested she'd been thinking about this visit for days. The bread was from the good bakery. The turkey was actual turkey, not pressed parts. She'd even remembered he liked mustard, not mayo. "Thank you," Jack said, for coming." "Of course. How's Tommy doing?" "Really?" Carol took her time answering, the way she always did when the truth required precision. "He's struggling. The divorce is hitting him harder than he's admitting. He doesn't want to be like you, but he doesn't know how to be different. It's like watching someone try to outrun their own shadow." "I told him he's not me." "Did you tell him how to not be you? Did you give him tools or just platitudes?" "Direct hit." Jack set down his sandwich. "I don't have tools. I'm barely keeping my own head above water." "Then you figure it out together. That's what this house is for, isn't it? Not just renovation, reconstruction." Carol gestured at the walls around them. "You're not just rebuilding Jim's house. You're rebuilding what got broken between generations." They talked until dark, covering ground they'd avoided for years. The end of their marriage, the mistakes they'd both made, the ways love can curdle into resentment when neither person knows how to say, "I'm drowning, help me." When she finally left, she hugged him at the door, and it felt like forgiveness, or at least the possibility of it. "You're doing good work here, Jack. Both kinds." He stood in the doorway and watched her taillights disappear, feeling something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen for a very long time. The house was teaching him things he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. That fixing what's broken starts with admitting it's broken. That some damage can be repaired if you're willing to do the work. That legacy isn't what you leave behind when you die. It's what you build while you're still breathing. Jim Morrison had known that, had tried to teach him that, and Jack had been too proud, too busy, too convinced he knew better to listen. But he was listening now. Week 6 ended with both men exhausted, the house half finished, and the budget tighter than anyone wanted to admit. They sat on the porch as the sun set, neither ready to drive back to their separate lives just yet. "Mia asked me something yesterday," Tommy said. "Asked if we were friends now." "What did you tell her?" "I told her we're trying." Jack nodded. "That's honest." "Yeah." The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two people who'd spent so long not talking that words felt clumsy and insufficient. Finally, Tommy spoke again. "Earl Patterson stopped by my place. Told me stories about Grandpa. About how he built this house mostly alone because he couldn't afford help. Said it took him 3 years. I didn't know that. There's a lot we don't know. About him, about each other." Tommy stood, stretched, his back cracking like kindling. "But we've got time. If we don't quit." "I'm not quitting. Neither am I." They shook hands like business partners, which was something even if it wasn't everything. As Tommy's truck pulled away, Jack walked back into the house. His father's house. Their house now. 4 walls, a roof, and enough second chances to last 3 lifetimes. He pulled out his phone and started a text to Tommy. "Same time tomorrow?" The response came immediately. "Yeah. Bring better coffee, though. That gas station stuff is killing me." Jack smiled, and it felt almost natural. Progress. Slow, painful, imperfect progress. But progress nonetheless. The house stood around him, half ruined and half restored, exactly like the men trying to save it. And in the gathering dark, Jack could almost hear his father's voice, patient and certain, saying what he'd always said when young Jack got frustrated with a difficult project. "Just keep working, son. Just keep working. That's how anything worth doing gets done. So Jack would keep working. They both would. One board at a time, one conversation at a time, one chance at a time, until something broken became whole again. December arrived like a creditor demanding payment, the kind of cold that found every gap in the walls, every crack in the foundation, every weakness in a man's resolve. Jack Morrison woke on the first day of the month to frost coating the inside of the bedroom window and his breath visible in the air. The space heater he'd been running had given up sometime during the night, expired like so many other things in his life that had worked until they didn't. He dressed in the sleeping bag, a trick learned from construction sites in Montana back when he was young enough to think sleeping in a truck was an adventure rather than a defeat. His fingers fumbled with buttons. 58 years old and his hands didn't work the way they used to, especially in cold. Arthritis, the doctor had said. Normal for your age, as if normal made it hurt less. The house groaned around him, settling deeper into winter. Pipes that needed insulation, windows that needed replacing, a furnace that wheezed like a dying man every time it cycled on. The list of repairs had grown longer, while the money had grown shorter. Jack pulled out his phone and opened the banking app he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. Checking account, $2,847. They'd started with $12,000 in combined savings, $5,000 for the house. That left $7,000 for materials. Over the past 3 months, they'd spent $3,000 on foundation materials and the emergency roof repair after the storm, $1,200 on electrical supplies and the code-required panel upgrade, $800 on plumbing fixtures and copper pipe. The discovered basement and Evelyn's $3,000 gift had kept them afloat for a few weeks. But that money was gone now too, eaten by the endless appetite of a house determined to reveal every hidden problem. The math was brutal and simple. They'd spent roughly $11,000 on a house they'd bought for fun, $16,000 total investment, and they still needed at least another $20,000 to finish. Maybe 30 if they kept finding surprises at the current rate. The renovation wasn't halfway done and they were completely broke. Jack made coffee on the camping stove they'd been using since the kitchen wasn't functional. Watching the sun rise through windows his father had installed in 1967. Jim Morrison had special ordered those windows from a supplier in Cincinnati, triple pane before anyone knew to care about energy efficiency. They'd lasted 57 years. They'd last another 50 if someone cared enough to maintain them. If someone had the money to maintain them. His phone buzzed. Tommy. Can't make it today. Mia had nightmare. Be there by 9. No apology. No explanation beyond the bare minimum. Jack had noticed Tommy pulling back over the past week, showing up late, leaving early, his mind clearly elsewhere. The divorce papers had been filed. Sarah wasn't fighting for custody, but she was fighting for the house, the car, the savings account Tommy didn't have anymore because he'd spent it all on materials for this renovation. Materials that sat in neat stacks in the living room, waiting to be installed by 2 men who were running out of time and patience and the will to keep pretending this was going to work. Jack texted back, "Okay, tomorrow then." No response. He spent the day alone working on the master bathroom, ripping out tile his mother had chosen in 1972, avocado green and harvest gold, the colors of a decade that believed the future would be bright and warm. Beneath the tile, he found water damage. Beneath the water damage, he found rot. Beneath the rot, he found a subfloor so compromised that his boot went through it like paper. Another $4,000 in repairs, minimum. Jack sat on the edge of the bathtub that would need to be replaced and did the math he'd been avoiding for weeks. Even if they could somehow find the money to finish, even if they poured another $30,000 into this place, the market wouldn't support more than a $60,000 sale. Not in rural Ohio, not in Millfield, where the biggest employer had closed 10 years ago, and half the houses on the street were for sale signs like badges of defeat. They were underwater, financially, literally, given the basement flooding, and metaphorically, which hurt worst of all. His phone rang, not Tommy, Carol. "Hey, you sound terrible," she said without preamble. "I feel terrible. Tommy told me he's taking a few days off, said you'd understand." "I don't understand. We have work to do." Carol was quiet for the moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Jack, he's going through a divorce. He's broke. He's working a job that pays nothing and a side project that's costing everything he has. And his father, who he barely knows, is pushing him to finish a house that might bankrupt them both. Can you understand why he might need a break? Each word landed like a hammer. True, accurate, devastating. This was supposed to fix things, Jack said quietly. Buildings don't fix relationships. People do. And people need time and space and grace you're not giving him. I don't have grace to give. I used it all up being selfish for 30 years. Then find some, Carol said and hung up. Jack sat in the gutted bathroom of his father's house and felt the full weight of his failures pressed down until he couldn't breathe. The heart attack warning from 2 months ago suddenly felt less like a warning and more like a prophecy. Pain radiated down his left arm. His vision narrowed. The room tilted sideways, and he grabbed the sink to keep from falling. But the sink wasn't bolted down yet, and it tipped with him. He hit the floor hard enough to see stars. Lay there staring at exposed joists and cobwebs and the underside of a dream that was collapsing. The pain in his chest bloomed like fire. He fumbled for his phone, couldn't make his fingers work, dropped it. The screen shattered on impact. Appropriate, he thought. Everything breaking at once. Time did strange things then, stretched and compressed. He might have been on that floor for minutes or hours. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, irregular and wrong, could taste copper in his mouth, could feel his father's ghost standing over him saying, "I told you so. I told you you'd end up here, alone, surrounded by your failures." Except his father had never said that, never said anything cruel. That voice was his own. The sound of a truck in the driveway pulled him back. Footsteps on the porch. Tommy's voice calling out, "Jack, your truck's here, but you didn't answer your phone." He tried to respond, managed something between a groan and a word. Tommy found him 30 seconds later, knelt beside him without hesitation, hands checking for injuries with the competence of someone who'd spent enough time on job sites to know what a real emergency looked like. "Don't move, I'm calling 911. "No." Jack grabbed Tommy's wrist, surprised by the strength in his own grip. "No ambulance. Can't afford it." "Dad, you're on the floor. You can't get up. We're calling." "Dad." The word hit harder than the fall. Tommy hadn't called him that since the wedding 8 years ago. "I'm okay, just dizzy. Help me to the couch." Tommy looked at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "You need a hospital. I need you to help me stand up." They stared at each other, wills colliding in the space between them. Finally, Tommy yielded, but only partially. He helped Jack to the living room, deposited him on the couch with the care usually reserved for explosives, and sat in the chair across from him with arms crossed. "What happened?" "I fell." "Why?" "Because I'm old and clumsy, and this house is trying to kill me. Try again, and don't lie." So Jack told him. The bathroom, the rot, the subfloor, the brutal mathematics of pouring $16,000 into a house that would never be worth more than 60, the checking account balance that wouldn't cover another week of materials, the crushing realization that they'd bet everything on a project designed to fail. Tommy listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When Jack finished, the silence stretched so long Jack thought maybe he'd already left, mentally if not physically. "How long have you known?" Tommy asked finally. 2 weeks, maybe 3, and you didn't say anything." "I thought I could fix it. I thought if I worked harder, longer, if I just pushed through." "You thought you could do it alone." Tommy stood, paced to the window, looked out at the yard where snow was starting to fall. "That's your whole problem, you know that? You think asking for help makes you weak. You think needing people makes you less of a man. So you carry everything yourself until it crushes you, and then you're surprised when you end up on the floor. That's not fair, isn't it?" Tommy turned, and his eyes carried the weight of 30 years of disappointment. "You know what Sarah said when she left? She said I was just like you, isolated, stubborn, so determined to prove I could handle everything that I pushed away everyone who tried to help. And she was right." The words hung in the cold air between them. "I never meant for you to—" "I know. You never mean anything. It just happens. Consequences without intention. That's the Morrison family legacy." Tommy grabbed his jacket from the chair. "Where are you going?" "Away, before I say something we can't take back." "Tommy, wait!" But he was already out the door, truck starting before Jack could stand. The sound of the engine faded, leaving Jack alone with the ghosts and the silence and the undeniable truth that he'd done it again. Pushed away the one person who mattered because he didn't know how to do anything else. The snow fell harder as afternoon became evening. Jack sat on the couch and watched it accumulate, white covering brown, the world becoming clean and pristine and deceptive. Underneath, everything was still broken. The snow just made it prettier. His phone was beyond repair, screen spiderwebbed into opacity. He'd have to drive to town for a replacement, which meant money he didn't have for a device he didn't want. But isolation wasn't optional anymore. He needed to be reachable, in case Tommy called, in case Tommy came back, in case this wasn't the end. He dozed off sometime after dark and woke to pounding on the door. The kind of pounding that suggested whoever was on the other side had been at it for a while. Jack stumbled to the entrance, expecting Tommy, finding Earl Patterson instead. The old man stood on the porch with snow in his hair and fury in his eyes. "You got some nerve," Earl said by way of greeting. "It's late. It's 7, and we need to talk." Earl pushed past him into the house, tracking snow and judgment in equal measure. He surveyed the living room, the stacks of materials, the half-finished walls, the visible evidence of a project dying in real time. "Tommy came by my place, said the whole thing's falling apart. Tommy talks too much. Tommy's scared. Said you nearly died today and won't see a doctor. Said the money's gone and you didn't tell him. Said you're doing it again, shutting everyone out, trying to carry the world alone." Earl jabbed a finger at Jack's chest. "Your daddy did the same thing. Worked himself into the ground because he thought that's what men do. And you know what it got him? Dead at 65 with a son who couldn't be bothered to visit. The accusation was designed to wound, and it succeeded. I loved my father. Maybe, but you didn't show up for him, just like you're not showing up for Tommy, just like you didn't show up for this house until it was almost too late." Earl walked to the window, looked out at the falling snow. "You know what Jim told me the day he got his diagnosis? Said his biggest regret wasn't the cancer. It was that he'd taught you to value work over people. Said he'd shown you how to build houses, but never taught you how to build a family. He never said that to me, because you were never here to hear it." The truth of it drove the breath from Jack's lungs. He sat down hard, his body remembering the earlier fall, the pain in his chest, the sensation of everything coming apart at once. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. "You start by being honest, with Tommy, with yourself, about what this is really about." Earl crossed the room, lowered himself into the chair with the slow care of a man whose knees had seen better decades. "This house, you're not renovating it for your daddy's memory. You're doing it because you think if you can fix the house, you can fix everything else. The failed marriage, the estranged son, the wasted years. But houses are just wooden nails, Jack. They don't absolve sins. Then what's the point? The point is the doing, the showing up, the working beside your son instead of working at him. Your daddy understood that. Why do you think he left all those plans, all those notes? He was giving you a reason to come back, a project big enough that you'd need help, that you'd have to work with Tommy instead of alone." Jack looked at the old man, really looked, and saw something he'd missed before. The way Earl's eyes went soft when he talked about Jim Morrison. The way his voice carried affection underneath the anger. "You loved him," Jack said, "my father. Like a brother. Worked beside him for 40 years. Built half the houses in this county together. And I watched him wait for a son who never came home. So yeah, I'm angry, because I see you making the same mistakes, and I see Tommy paying the same price." They sat in silence as the snow continued to fall, accumulating on a world already buried under too much weight. Finally, Earl spoke again. "There's a town meeting tomorrow night. Robert Chen is presenting his development plan. Wants to buy up 12 properties, including this one, tear them down, build an industrial park. He's offering good money. $75,000 for this place, as is." Jack's head came up. $75,000? Cash, quick close, no contingencies. The number echoed in Jack's mind. $75,000 would cover all the debts, pay Tommy back every dollar he'd invested, leave enough for Jack to start over somewhere else. Somewhere without ghosts, without failures, without the daily reminder of everything he'd ruined. "Council's voting Thursday," Earl continued. "They're expected to approve. Property values would triple, tax base would expand, jobs would come back to Millfield. On paper, it's a good deal. But paper doesn't account for history, for the fact that Jim Morrison built this house with his bare hands during the worst year of his life, for the fact that 12 families have roots here going back generations, for the fact that some things can't be measured in dollars." Earl stood, joints popping like kindling. "You got a choice to make, Jack Morrison. You can take the money and run, Or you can stay and fight, but either way, you can't do it alone. And you can't do it without being honest with your son. He left Jack alone with that truth, door closing behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. Jack didn't sleep that night. He paced the house, walking from room to room, touching walls his father had built, floors his father had laid, fixtures his father had installed with care and precision, and the unshakable belief that what you build with your hands matters more than what you earn with your labor. In the master bedroom, he found his father's notebook again, flipped through pages of careful sketches and detailed plans and those marginal notes that read like love letters from the grave. One page stopped him, a drawing of the front porch, restored to glory, with a note in Jim's distinctive hand for sitting with grandchildren on summer evenings, for watching the world go by, for being present in the moment instead of always reaching for the next one. Jack pressed his palm against the page and felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain this time, something deeper and more dangerous. The kind of grief that's been waiting 30 years to surface. His father hadn't been teaching him carpentry. He'd been teaching him how to be present, how to build things that lasted, how to value moments over milestones. And Jack had been so busy climbing the ladder, he'd never looked down to see what he was stepping on. He pulled out his father's old flip phone, the one he'd found in a drawer, still holding a charge after all these years because Jim Morrison had been the kind of man who maintained everything, even phones he no longer used. The contact list showed 3 entries: home, work, Jack. Jack's number was still there, still saved, still waiting for a call that never came. He sat on the floor of his father's bedroom and wept. Not the silent tears of men who've learned to cry quietly. The full-body sobs of someone who's held grief so long it's become part of their skeleton. He cried for his father, dead 15 years, for his marriage, dead 5, for his relationship with Tommy, dying in real time, for every moment he'd chosen wrong, every priority he'd misplaced, every person he'd failed, because he thought success was measured in buildings designed and contracts signed. The snow fell outside, covering the world in white, and inside Jack Morrison finally broke. Dawn found him still on that floor, empty and raw and strangely lighter. The kind of exhaustion that comes after a fever breaks. He pulled himself up, joints protesting, and looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Red eyes, gray stubble, the face of a man who'd hit bottom and found it unexpectedly solid. His father's toolbox sat on the counter. Jack opened it, removed the block plane, ran his thumb along the blade. Still sharp. His father had taught him to maintain tools, to treat them with respect, to understand that a craftsman is only as good as his equipment and his integrity. Jack had forgotten the second part. He drove into town just after sunrise, snow still falling in fat flakes that stuck to the windshield. The hardware store wouldn't open for another hour, so he sat in the parking lot and watched Millfield wake up. The diner across the street, the antique shop that never seemed to have customers, the post office with the flag already raised. Small-town America, dying slowly, killed by economics and demographics and the relentless march of progress that didn't care about history or heritage or handmade houses built by men with more pride than money. Robert Chen's industrial park would change all that. Tax revenue. The promise of renewal through demolition. On paper, like Earl said, it made sense. But paper couldn't measure what would be lost. His phone buzzed. New phone purchased yesterday from the Verizon store with a credit card that was approaching its limit. Tommy. We need to talk. Yeah, Jack replied. We do. They met at the diner, neutral ground, booth in the back, where the coffee was always hot and the eggs always came with a side of judgment from the waitress who'd known them both since they were kids. Tommy arrived first, already halfway through his coffee, looking like he hadn't slept either. Jack slid into the opposite side of the booth. I'm sorry. For what, specifically? Because the list is long. For not telling you about the money, for pushing too hard, for thinking I could fix everything if I just worked hard enough, for being exactly what Carol said I was, stubborn, isolated, and too proud to ask for help. Tommy blinked. Did you rehearse that? Spent all night on it. It shows. Tommy signaled the waitress for more coffee. Earl came by this morning, said you and I need to get our heads out of our asses and face reality. He has a way with words. He also told me about the offer, $75,000. There it was, the number sitting between them like a third person. I'm considering it, Jack said. Good, you should. Jack looked at his son, surprised. You think we should sell? I think we should be realistic. We're broke. We spent 16,000 and we're maybe 40% done. The house needs another 30,000 in work we can't afford. I'm about to lose my contractor's license over unpaid violations. You nearly died yesterday. What exactly are we fighting for? I thought we were fighting for us, for a second chance. Maybe some things don't get second chances, Tommy said quietly. Maybe the best we can do is cut our losses and move on before we destroy each other completely. The words landed like blows. Jack opened his mouth to argue, to push back, to do what he always did when someone suggested he might be wrong. But Earl's voice echoed in his head. You can't do it alone. You can't do it without being honest. You're right, Jack said instead. Tommy's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. What? You're right. We're broke. The house is too far gone. We're not qualified for this. We should take the money and walk away. Jack paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man defusing a bomb. But I want you to understand something first. This was never about the house. It was about having a reason to work beside you. A project big enough that I couldn't do it alone. A way to prove that I could show up, could be present, could be the father I never was. By bankrupting us both, by trying, just trying, which I know isn't enough, but it's all I have. Tommy set his cup down carefully. You want honesty? Real honesty? Please, I don't trust you. I don't trust that you'll stick around when things get hard. I don't trust that you won't disappear into your work the second this project ends. I don't trust that you know how to be anything other than what you've always been. Tommy's voice cracked. And I'm terrified that I'm exactly the same. That I'll do to Mia what you did to me. That I'll wake up in 30 years and realize I wasted my life building things instead of relationships. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful and true. So what do we do? Jack asked. I don't know. But I know we can't keep pretending this house will fix us. Houses don't fix people. People fix people, and we're both too broken to fix each other. They sat in silence, drinking bad coffee in a diner that had survived 4 recessions and countless personal disasters. Around them, Millfield went about its business, old men arguing about the weather, young mothers wrestling with toddlers, life continuing despite everything. The waitress brought their eggs. They ate without tasting, mechanical and silent, 2 men who'd run out of words and hope in equal measure. Finally, Jack spoke. The town meeting is tonight. Chen's presenting his proposal. Are you going? Should I? Tommy considered. Grandpa would have gone. He would have stood up and fought for this place, for what it represented. Your grandfather was a better man than me. Yeah, Tommy agreed. He was. They finished their breakfast, split the check, walked to their separate trucks parked side by side in the lot. Snow had accumulated on the windshields, white and clean and temporary. Underneath, everything was still the same. See you at the meeting? Tommy asked. Maybe, I don't know yet. Tommy nodded, started to leave, then turned back. You asked what we're fighting for. You want the real answer? We're fighting to not be like them. Like the developers who see numbers instead of history. Like the system that values profit over people. Like every force that says small towns don't matter, and old houses should be torn down, and traditions should be abandoned because they're not efficient enough. He paused. Maybe we lose. Maybe Chen wins and the house gets demolished and we end up with nothing. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have fought for something that mattered. He drove away, leaving Jack standing in the parking lot, snow falling on his shoulders, everything suddenly very clear. The meeting hall was packed that night. Jack arrived late, stood in the back, watched Robert Chen make his presentation with the slick confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. Charts showing job growth, projections of tax revenue, before and after renderings that made the industrial park look like salvation itself. The council members nodded, the audience murmured. Progress, they said, opportunity, the future. Then Chen showed the acquisition map. 12 properties highlighted in red. 12 families who'd be displaced. 12 histories erased. And there in the center, Jim Morrison's house. The farmhouse built in 1965 by a man with 2 hands and a dream, in the stubborn belief that what you build with care will outlast you. Jack felt something shift in his chest, not pain this time. Certainty. When Chen finished, the moderator asked for public comment. Silence. No one wanted to be the voice against progress, against the promise of renewal. Jack raised his hand. Yes, in the back? He walked to the front, aware of every eye on him, aware of Tommy in the third row watching, aware of Earl 2 seats over, arms crossed, aware of Carol slipping in the side door, arriving late but arriving nonetheless. "My name is Jack Morrison," he began, voice steadier than he felt, "and I want to tell you about my father." The meeting hall held its breath. 73 people packed into folding chairs meant for 50. The overflow, standing against walls, painted the color of forgotten promises. Jack Morrison stood at the podium, feeling every one of his 58 years in the weight of their stares. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting shadows that made everyone look tired and old and worn down by the same forces that had brought them all here tonight. Robert Chen sat in the front row, expensive suit and practiced smile, tablet computer resting on his knee like a weapon he hadn't needed to draw yet. The town council lined the table at the front, 7 people who'd known Jim Morrison, who'd bought houses he'd built, who'd shake his hand at the hardware store and say things like, "They don't make them like you anymore, Jim." And now they were preparing to vote yes on tearing down everything he'd made. Jack gripped the podium, felt the wood solid beneath his palms, and began. "My name is Jack Morrison. Some of you remember me. Most of you probably wish you didn't. I'm Jim Morrison's son, the one who left town 40 years ago and barely looked back. The one who couldn't be bothered to visit when his father was dying. The one who showed up for the funeral and disappeared again before the reception ended." He could feel Tommy's eyes on him from the third row, could sense Carol's presence near the door, could see Earl leaning forward, listening with the intensity of a man who'd waited years to hear this speech. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm here to tell you about a man who spent his entire life building things that mattered. Not because they were profitable, not because they made sense on a spreadsheet, but because he believed that what we make with our hands says something about who we are." Jack pulled the folded paper from his pocket, his father's note, the one that had been waiting in the toolbox for 15 years. "My father left me his house, not because it was worth anything. It isn't. It's falling apart. It needs $40,000 in repairs we don't have. The roof leaks. The foundation is cracked. A competent inspector would condemn it tomorrow." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Chen's smile widened slightly. "But before he died, my father drew up plans, detailed blueprints for how to restore every inch of that house. He labeled every board, every joint, every measurement. And in the margins, he wrote notes, little comments, instructions, and every single one of them was addressed to me." Jack's voice cracked. He didn't try to hide it. He spent the last 15 years of his life planning a renovation for a son who never called, never visited, never showed the slightest interest in the house or the man who built it. He believed I'd come back. He believed that someday, when I was ready, I'd see what he saw. That a house isn't just wood and nails. It's a testament. It's proof that you were here, that you mattered, that you built something that will outlast you. He looked directly at Chen. "Mr. Chen's proposal is financially sound. $75,000 per property. Quick close, no contingencies. Jobs for the community. Tax revenue for the town. On paper, it makes perfect sense." Jack paused, let the admission hang in the air. "But here's what the paper doesn't show. My father built that house in 1965. Took him 3 years working nights and weekends while holding down a job at the mill. He hand-selected every piece of lumber, milled his own trim, poured the foundation himself because he couldn't afford a crew. And when he finished, he had built something that would last 100 years. Not because it had to, because he believed that quality mattered more than speed. That care mattered more than that leaving something beautiful behind was worth the sacrifice." The room had gone completely silent. Even the council members had stopped their fidgeting. "This town is full of houses like that, built by men like my father. Men who believed that craftsmanship was a form of dignity, that what you made with your hands was a measure of your character. And now we're being asked to tear all of that down for an industrial park that will employ 30 people and generate tax revenue that will mostly go to paying for the infrastructure damage caused by the industrial park." Chen stood. "Mr. Morrison, with all due respect, nostalgia doesn't pay mortgages. Your father's generation is gone. This town needs jobs, not museums to the past." "You're right," Jack said, and saw surprise flash across Chen's face. "Nostalgia doesn't pay mortgages, but neither does destroying the last remaining evidence that this town once built things that mattered. You want to know what will happen if this proposal passes? I'll tell you. You'll get your industrial park. It'll operate for maybe 10 years before the company realizes they can get cheaper labor overseas and they'll close. Leave behind a rusting hulk and contaminated soil and broken promises. And the houses you tore down, the history you erased, the proof that Millfield once produced craftsmen who took pride in their work, that'll be gone forever. He turned to address the full room. My father was far from perfect. He worked too much. He didn't know how to talk about feelings. He struggled to show affection in ways that weren't building something or fixing something or creating something. But he showed up. Every day, for 40 years, he built this town, house by house. And he did it believing that quality and care and craftsmanship would matter to someone, would mean something. Jack's hands were shaking now. He pressed them flat against the podium. I wasted 30 years of my life believing that success was measured in contracts signed, in buildings designed, and money earned. I walked away from everything my father tried to teach me because I thought I was better than him. Smarter, more sophisticated. And you know what I have to show for it? A failed marriage, an estranged son, a career that ended when they decided I was too old and too expensive and too obsolete. The admission cost him something. He could feel it tearing out of his chest with each word. But I have one last chance. My son and I are trying to restore that house together. We're probably going to fail. We're definitely going to go broke. But we're going to fail trying to build something that matters. Something that says we were here, that we cared, that we believe some things are worth more than their sale price. He looked at the council members, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. So here's what I'm asking. Before you vote to let Mr. Chen tear down 12 houses built by men who poured their lives into this town, I want you to ask yourselves one question. What do you want Millfield to be? A town that preserves what matters? Or a town that sells its history to the highest bidder? Jack stepped back from the podium. The silence that followed felt like the space between a lightning strike and thunder. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slow at first, then faster, then others joined. Not everyone, maybe not even half, but enough. Earl stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 72 years in this town. Jack Morrison left us, that's true, but he came back, and he's trying to do right by his father's legacy. That's more than can be said for most of us. Jim Morrison built half the houses in this town, built them to last, built them with pride, and if we let them get torn down for an industrial park that'll be abandoned in a decade, then shame on us, shame on all of us. The moderator, a woman named Patricia who taught third grade for 40 years and had no patience for nonsense, banged her gavel. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Chen, do you wish to respond? Chen stood, smooth as oil, and smiled like a man holding all the cards. I appreciate Mr. Morrison's passion, I do. But passion doesn't create jobs. Passion doesn't pay for new roads or school funding or the infrastructure this town desperately needs. My company is offering a lifeline to a community that's been dying for 20 years. Yes, some old houses will be demolished. That's unfortunate. But the alternative is watching those houses continue to decay until they collapse on their own. At least this way, Millfield gets something in return. He pulled up a slide on the projection screen. Charts, graphs, numbers that looked impressive if you didn't think too hard about where they came from. 10-year projections show employment growth of 35%, property values increasing by 40%, tax revenue doubling. This isn't about destroying history, it's about building a future. And I would argue that's exactly what Jim Morrison would have wanted. A town that survives, that thrives, that doesn't cling to the past at the expense of the future. Chen sat down and Jack felt the momentum shift. Because Chen was right about one thing, numbers don't lie. On paper, his proposal made perfect sense. Jack was offering nostalgia and sentiment, and the vague promise that craftsmanship matters. Chen was offering jobs and money, and the concrete hope of renewal. The moderator looked at the council. Any questions before we vote? Councilman Davis, who owned the hardware store and had sold Jim Morrison probably $10,000 in supplies over the years, raised his hand. Jack, you said you and your son are trying to restore the house. How far along are you? About 40%. We've replaced the electrical, reinforced the foundation, reframed the load-bearing walls, installed new windows in the front. We're underwater financially and behind schedule, but we're making progress. And if the council votes no on this proposal, if we don't let Mr. Chen buy the properties, What happens to your house? Jack opened his mouth to give the optimistic answer. The one that said they'd find a way, they'd make it work, they'd finish the renovation and prove that preservation was possible. But he promised himself honesty, and honesty required acknowledging reality. We'll probably lose it anyway, Jack said quietly. We're broke. The bank won't give us a loan against a property that's worth less than what we owe. We've got maybe 2 months before we run out of money completely. So voting no doesn't save the house. It just means it'll rot away slowly instead of being torn down quickly. The honesty landed like a punch. He could see it in their faces. The resignation, the inevitability, the understanding that sometimes fighting doesn't change the outcome, it just prolongs the suffering. Councilwoman Zhang, who'd moved to Millfield from San Francisco 15 years ago and always voted for economic development, leaned forward. So you're asking us to turn down a financially sound proposal that would benefit the entire town to save a house that's going to be lost either way? No, Jack said. I'm asking you to consider what gets lost when we stop believing that quality matters. When we stop valuing the work of people who built things to last. When we decide that everything is disposable if the price is right. She nodded slowly. That's a compelling philosophical argument, Mr. Morrison. But philosophy doesn't pay my mortgage either. The vote was called. Show of hands. Simple majority needed. Jack watched from his position at the back of the room. Watched 5 hands go up for approval. Watched 2 hands stay down. Watched Patricia's face as she prepared to declare the measure passed. And then Tommy stood. Jack's son walked to the front of the room with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested volcanic forces barely contained. He didn't ask permission to speak, just stood beside his father and addressed the council directly. My name is Tommy Morrison. I'm Jim Morrison's grandson, and I want to tell you what it's like to grow up knowing your grandfather was a legend and your father was a ghost. The room went quiet again. Different quiet this time, the kind that comes when someone is about to tell an uncomfortable truth. My grandfather built that house with his hands. My father walked away from it, and I spent my whole life trying to figure out which one of them I was going to be, the builder or the ghost. Tommy's voice was steady, but Jack could see his hands trembling. 2 months ago, my father called me. First time in 3 years. Said he needed help with Grandpa's house. Said he'd pay me, and I said yes because I needed the money. Because I'm getting divorced and I'm broke, and I'm about to lose my contractor's license because I'm drowning in debt. I said yes for all the wrong reasons. He looked at Jack, really looked at him, and something passed between them that had no name but felt like grace. But somewhere along the way, working on that house, learning to work beside my father instead of resenting him, I figured something out. My grandfather didn't build that house to create an asset. He built it to prove that he could create something beautiful in a world that told him he wasn't good enough. He was a farmer's son with an 8th grade education. Nobody thought he could build a house that would last 60 years. But he did, because he believed that craftsmanship was a form of dignity. Tommy turned to Chen. Your industrial park will employ 30 people for maybe a decade. My grandfather employed his pride for 40 years. Which one of those is the better investment? Chen's smile had frozen in place, plastic and unconvincing. And here's the thing you don't understand, Mr. Chen. You can't build what my grandfather built. You can construct, you can manufacture, you can produce, but you can't build. Because building requires giving a damn. It requires believing that what you make will outlast you. That someone 50 years from now will touch the work you did and know that you cared. Tommy's voice grew stronger. This town is dying. You're right about that. But it's not dying because we don't have enough industrial parks. It's dying because we stopped believing that what we make matters, that quality matters, that craftsmanship and care and taking the time to do things right are values worth preserving. He looked at the council again. My father and I are going to lose that house. He's right about that too. We don't have the money to finish the renovation. We're going to fail, but we're going to fail trying to prove that some things are worth more than their sale price. And if you vote yes on this proposal, you're saying that nothing is worth more than money, that history doesn't matter, that the work of men like my grandfather is disposable. Tommy sat down. The silence that followed was different, heavier, pregnant with the weight of a decision that would define what Millfield believed about itself. Patricia looked at the council. In light of the testimony, I'm calling for a 10-minute recess before we vote. Council members, please use this time to consider carefully. The room erupted into conversation. Jack found himself surrounded by people he hadn't seen in decades. Old neighbors, his father's friends, People who'd watched him grow up and leave and never come back. Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived 3 houses down for 50 years, grabbed his hand. Your father would be proud of you, both of you. We're going to lose the house anyway, Mrs. Henderson. Maybe, but you tried, that's what matters. Earl appeared at Jack's elbow, steered him toward the hallway where the coffee was bad and the air was slightly less suffocating. That took guts, Earl said. That took stupidity. I just convinced the council to vote against their economic interests based on sentiment. You convinced them to consider what they're trading away. Outcomes not guaranteed, but at least they're thinking about it. Tommy joined them, still vibrating with adrenaline. Father and son stood in the hallway of a municipal building that had seen better decades, drinking terrible coffee and waiting for 7 people to decide the fate of a house that was probably doomed anyway. Why'd you do that? Jack asked quietly. Stand up, speak. Because someone had to, and because I meant what I said. I'd rather fail trying than succeed at something that doesn't matter. When did you get so wise? When I started listening to the ghost instead of running from him. The 10-minute stretch to 20, then 30. Finally, Patricia emerged and called everyone back inside. The council members filed in looking grim. Never a good sign when politicians look serious. Patricia banged the gavel unnecessarily hard. The council has deliberated, and before we vote, I want to say something. She removed her reading glasses, folded them with care, and looked directly at Jack. This town has been dying for 20 years. We all know it. The mill closed, the young people left, the houses are falling apart. And we've been telling ourselves that if we could just attract the right business, just get the right development, we could save it. But Mr. Morrison asked us to consider what we're saving it for. And that's a question we haven't wanted to answer. She put her glasses back on. Millfield was built by craftsmen, farmers who became carpenters, laborers who became builders, people who took pride in the quality of their work because their work was all they had. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that. We started measuring success in dollars instead of dignity, in growth instead of craftsmanship. Patricia looked at Chen. Your proposal is financially sound, Mr. Chen. But it asked us to trade our history for your profit. And after hearing from the Morrisons, I don't think that's a trade worth making. She turned to the council. All in favor of denying the zoning variance that would allow the industrial park development? 4 hands went up immediately, then a 5th, then after a long pause, a 6th. Majority vote. Proposal denied. The room erupted. Some cheers, some protests. Chen standing and gathering his materials with the tight-lipped fury of a man who'd just wasted 3 months on a town that chose sentiment over sense. Jack felt like he'd been punched. They'd won. Somehow impossibly, they'd convinced a town council to vote against economic development for the sake of preserving houses that were falling apart anyway. And they'd still lost, because the house was still doomed and the money was still gone, and winning the battle had cost them the war. Tommy grabbed his arm. Did that just happen? I think so. We won. We delayed the inevitable. It's not the same thing. But Tommy was grinning like a man who just discovered he could fly. And Jack didn't have the heart to crush that moment with reality. Earl appeared, hand extended. Your father would have been proud. My father would have known how to actually save the house. Your father died broke, spent every dime on materials and tools and quality. Man never had more than $5,000 in the bank his entire life. But he left behind a town full of houses that'll outlast us all. Legacy isn't what you save, it's what you build. They filed out into the December night, snow still falling, the world clean and white and full of temporary grace. Chen pushed past them on the way to his rental car, muttering something about small-town ignorance and missed opportunities. Carol found them in the parking lot, hugged Tommy first, and then, more carefully, hugged Jack. That was brave, she said. That was stupid. It's the same thing sometimes. She left, and Jack stood with his son in the parking lot of Millfield Municipal Hall, watching their breath turn to clouds in the frozen air. So what now? Tommy asked. Now we go back to the house and figure out how to finish a renovation we can't afford. We could sell. Chen might still be willing to make an offer. After what we just did, he wouldn't pay $5 for that place. Tommy laughed, and the sound carried joy Jack hadn't heard in years. Then I guess we're committed. They drove in separate deadman trucks back to the farmhouse, that collection of boards and nails and history that Jim Morrison had built with the absolute certainty that it would matter to someone someday. The lights were on, Jack realized. He must have left them on when he rushed out for the meeting. The whole house glowed against the darkness, warm and inviting and completely unable to pay its own property taxes. Inside, the unfinished renovation greeted them. Raw drywall, exposed studs, the constant reminder that good intentions don't install plumbing. Tommy walked through the rooms, running his hand along the new framing they'd installed together. Jack watched his son move through his father's house and saw three generations converging in a single moment. "I have an idea," Tommy said finally. "Probably a terrible idea. Those are the only kind I have anymore. Join the club. What if we documented the restoration? Not for YouTube ad revenue, for real. A series showing every step, every mistake, every moment of two men who don't know what they're doing trying to save a house that probably can't be saved. People might watch that. People watch a lot of terrible things. That doesn't mean we should make more. But people also watch restoration videos. There's a whole community online. And if we can build an audience, maybe we can find sponsors. Maybe companies will donate materials in exchange for exposure. Maybe we can crowdfund the parts we can't afford." Jack looked at his son, really looked, and saw Jim Morrison staring back. The same optimism, the same stubborn belief that quality would somehow triumph over economics. The same willingness to try despite overwhelming evidence that trying wouldn't matter. "When did you become such an optimist?" "When I watched my father give a speech about craftsmanship to a room full of people who had every reason to choose money, and they chose history instead." Tommy pulled out his phone, started making notes. Equipment they'd need, software for editing, a content calendar. He talked fast, excited, planning like a man who'd just discovered purpose. And Jack felt something shift. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile, too likely to shatter. This was different. Possibility. The understanding that maybe, just maybe, they could build something that mattered. Not just a house, something bigger. They worked late into the night, not on the renovation, but on the plan. How to document, what to show, how to be honest about their failures while still creating something people would want to watch. How to turn a desperate gamble into content worth consuming. At some point, Carol showed up with coffee and sandwiches, refusing to explain how she knew they'd still be there. "You two look terrible," she observed. "We feel terrible," Jack confirmed, "but productively terrible." She sat with them, offering suggestions, poking holes in the weaker parts of their plan, being the voice of reason they'd both learned to trust. And slowly, across 4 hours and 6 pots of coffee and a dozen revised strategies, something resembling a plan emerged. They'd start filming tomorrow, document everything, the successes and the failures, the moments of triumph and the hours of frustration. They'd be honest about the money, about their relationship, about the fact that they were two men trying to repair more than just a house. "It might not work," Tommy said as midnight approached. "Probably won't," Jack agreed. "But we're doing it anyway." "Yeah, we are." Carol stood, stretched, gathered her things. "You Morrison men, always choosing the hard way." "It's genetic," Tommy said. "It's stubborn pride," she corrected. "But sometimes that's enough." She left them alone in the house. And for the first time since this whole thing started, the silence between them felt comfortable. Not perfect, not healed, but better. Jack walked to the window, looked out at the yard where snow continued to fall. Somewhere under that white blanket was the foundation his father had poured, the landscaping his mother had planned, the history of a family that had built and lost and tried to build again. "Your grandfather had a saying," Jack said quietly. "He'd tell me when I got frustrated with a project. Said the only difference between a good craftsman and a great one is that the great one knows how to fix his mistakes." "Did you ever become great?" "No, I walked away before I learned that lesson. But maybe it's not too late." Tommy joined him out of the window. Father and son, reflected in glass that needed cleaning, standing in a house that needed everything. "Tomorrow we start filming," Tommy said. "Tomorrow we start fixing our mistakes," Jack corrected. They stood there until the cold drove them to separate trucks and separate homes and separate beds, where sleep would be elusive and dreams would be complicated. But for the first time in longer than either could remember, they were moving in the same direction. Towards something, maybe not success, maybe not salvation, but towards something that mattered. And sometimes, Jack thought as he drove through the quiet streets of Millfield, sometimes that's enough. The house stood behind them, half ruined and half restored, waiting for two men to return in the morning and continue the work of making broken things whole. The same work that had been waiting for Jack Morrison his entire life. The same work he was finally, impossibly, ready to begin. The camera arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, 3 weeks after the town hall meeting, Tommy unpacked it from the shipping box with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Not expensive, not professional grade, but good enough to capture what mattered. Good enough to document two men trying to save a house that everyone, including themselves, knew was probably beyond saving. Jack stood in what would eventually be the kitchen, watching his son adjust settings and check angles and mutter about lighting. The space around them looked worse than when they'd started. Demo debris in corners, exposed wiring snaking through walls, the skeleton of a room waiting for someone to give it skin and substance. "Ready?" Tommy asked, positioning the camera on a tripod that wobbled slightly on the uneven subfloor. "To be filmed failing? Sure. To be filmed trying, there's a difference." Tommy hit record and the little red light blinked to life. Proof that this moment, this desperate gamble, this last attempt to make something of broken men and broken houses was now permanent, documented, real. "My name is Tommy Morrison," he said, speaking to the camera like it was a person who might actually care. "This is my father, Jack, and this is my grandfather's house, built in 1965, falling apart in 2024. We're going to try to save it. We're probably going to fail, but we're going to show you every step anyway." Jack felt uncomfortable under the camera's eye, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cold January air coming through gaps in the walls. But he stepped forward and added his piece. "I walked away from this house 40 years ago. Walked away from my father, from this town, from everything that mattered. And I'm trying to come back. We both are. This is the story of that attempt." Tommy stopped recording. They stood in silence, the moment captured, the commitment made. There was no backing out now. They told the camera, told whatever audience might eventually watch, that they were trying. And trying meant finishing, or at least dying in the attempt. The first video went live that night. Tommy edited it on his laptop at the card table that served as their furniture, their desk, their entire office infrastructure. 30 minutes condensed to 8. The house tour, their story, the honest admission that they had no idea what they were doing. "It looks terrible," Jack said, watching over Tommy's shoulder. "It looks real. That's better." Tommy uploaded it to YouTube with shaking hands, titled it "Two Men, One House, Zero Plan," wrote a description that was equal parts confession and plea. Then they sat and watched the view counter like gamblers watching a roulette wheel. 10 views in the first hour, probably family and bots. 50 views by morning, still nothing. 300 by the end of the first week, mostly from recommended algorithms testing the waters. The growth was slow, painfully, realistically slow. By the end of January, they had 200 subscribers. Most of them seemed to be other people attempting renovations, leaving comments about shared struggles, and offering advice from their own disasters. But something was building. Comments started appearing, real comments, from people who understood what they were attempting. "My dad and I restored his father's barn. Took us 5 years, best 5 years of my life. I walked away from my family's farm 30 years ago. Wish I'd gone back while I had the chance. This is real. Thank you for showing the mess, not just the pretty finished product." Tommy kept posting, 1 video a week, sometimes 2, documenting the work, the setbacks, the slow grinding progress of making something broken slightly less broken. The electrical installation, the plumbing repairs, the arguments about the right way to install crown molding. By the end of February, they had 800 subscribers. By March 2000, the algorithm was starting to notice, starting to recommend their videos to people who watched home renovation content. To men in their 50s who'd grown up in small towns, to sons with complicated relationships with their fathers, to anyone who'd ever tried to fix something broken and found it harder than expected. And with the subscribers came something unexpected. Offers. Small at first, a viewer in Columbus who worked for a lumber supplier reached out. Said he'd noticed they were using big box store materials, could get them contractor pricing if they mentioned the company in a video. 20% discount. Not much, but enough to matter when you're counting pennies. A tool company sent an email, said they'd been following the channel. Liked the authentic approach. Would they be interested in reviewing some products? Keep whatever they sent. Even Robert Chen surprisingly reached out. Brief, professional, an admission that he respected what they were trying to do, even if he thought it was economically foolish, and an offer to consult, free of charge, if they ran into structural issues beyond their expertise. Jack read that email 3 times trying to find the catch. "Maybe he's not entirely a villain," Tommy offered. Maybe he's just a businessman who recognizes good content when he sees it. Does it matter? We need the help. They did. God, they did. Because February brought problems that generosity couldn't solve. The furnace died completely. Not the wheeze and struggle of something failing, but the absolute silence of something dead. The estimate to replace it, $8,000, they didn't have. Jack sat in the basement, staring at the corpse of a heating system that was older than his marriage, and felt the familiar weight of impossibility settle on his shoulders. They'd made progress, real progress. The electrical was done, the plumbing was functional, the structural repairs were holding, but without heat, they couldn't finish the interior work, couldn't install drywall in a house that froze every night, couldn't ask Tommy to work in conditions that might actually kill them. He pulled out his phone, called a number he hadn't dialed in 5 years. Jack? Carol's voice carried surprise and concern in equal measure. The furnace died. I'm sorry. I need to ask you for money. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to hurt. How much? 8,000. I'll pay you back. Somehow. Eventually. I just need time. Jack, her voice went soft. You don't have to pay me back. Yes, I do. Then pay me back by finishing that house, by fixing things with Tommy, by becoming the man your father believed you could be. The check arrived 2 days later. Not a loan, a gift. With a note in Carol's careful handwriting, Jim would want this finished. So do I. Jack cashed it at the bank, feeling the weight of borrowed grace, and called the HV contractor. The new furnace went in over a weekend, efficient and modern, and completely at odds with the 1965 aesthetic of everything else. But it worked. And work, Jack was learning, mattered more than perfection. The channel continued to grow, but the growth remained organic, realistic, the kind that comes from genuine word of mouth rather than viral explosion. By April, they had 5,000 subscribers. Tommy's editing had improved, the videos had found their rhythm, and the story they were telling resonated with an audience hungry for authenticity. Comments poured in, stories of estranged fathers and prodigal sons, confessions of regret, admissions of hope, and slowly and possibly the money started following the attention. Ad revenue wasn't much, maybe $100 a month at first, but it was something, and sponsors were emerging. A paint company offered materials at cost. A flooring manufacturer sent samples. A window company, moved by the story of Jim Morrison's triple pane vision, donated 2 custom units to replace the worst of the broken ones. By early May, they had 8,000 subscribers and a modest budget again. Not comfortable, not secure, but possible. The work accelerated. Jack and Tommy fell into a rhythm, the camera documenting everything, the mistakes and the triumphs, the arguments about the right way to install crown molding, the quiet moments when they worked side by side without speaking, communication happening through the language of tools and shared purpose. Mia started appearing in the videos. 6 years old and completely unself-conscious about the camera, she'd show up on weekends and help by organizing screws and asking questions that forced Jack and Tommy to explain what they were doing in terms simple enough for a child to understand. The audience loved her. Comments flooded in about how sweet she was, how lucky they were, how beautiful it was to see 3 generations working together. What the comments didn't see was the custody battle happening in parallel. Sarah, Tommy's ex-wife, had filed for primary custody, arguing that Tommy was unstable, financially insecure, obsessed with a project that was draining him emotionally and economically. The court date was set for late May. Tommy didn't mention it in the videos, didn't talk about it much at all, but Jack could see it in the way his son held Mia a little tighter when she had to leave, in the way Tommy's hands shook slightly when his phone rang with Sarah's ringtone, in the exhaustion that went deeper than physical labor. They were in the master bedroom installing the final pieces of trim when Tommy finally broke. I might lose her. Jack didn't need to ask who. When's the hearing? 3 weeks. Sarah's lawyer is good. She's got a stable home, stable income, stable life. I've got a half-finished renovation project and a YouTube channel with 8,000 subscribers who don't pay child support. You've got more than that. Yeah, what else do I have? Jack set down his nail gun, turned to face his son directly. You've got a father who's learning to show up. You've got a community that believes in what you're building. You've got proof that you're trying to be better than you were. Courts don't care about trying, they care about results. Then we make sure they see results. Over the next 3 weeks, they worked like men possessed, 16-hour days. Drywall went up, got taped, got mudded, got sanded until the dust coated everything in fine white powder. Floors got refinished. The oak Jim Morrison had laid in 1967 brought back to warm honey glow. The kitchen came together piece by piece, cabinets hung with precision, countertops installed level within a 16th of an inch. The videos documented all of it. The audience watched in real time as the house transformed. Comments turned into encouragement. The subscriber count climbed past 10,000, then 12, then 15. Viewers from across the country sent messages of support. Some sent money, small donations with notes that said things like, "For Mia," and "Keep fighting." Earl showed up most evenings, ostensibly to check their work, but really to tell stories about Jim Morrison. About the time Jim spent 6 months hand-carving balusters for the staircase because he couldn't afford to buy them. About how Jim would redo entire sections if they weren't perfect, even if no one would ever see the flaw. "Your daddy had a saying," Earl told them one night while they were installing the restored staircase balusters. "Said that a house remembers how it was built. Said you could feel the difference between work done with care and work done for money. That the house knew, even if people didn't." Jack ran his hand along the smooth walnut, feeling the grooves his father had carved 50 years ago. The house remembered, and maybe in some way that defied logic his father did too. The custody hearing arrived on a Tuesday in late May. Spring had come to Ohio, turning the world green and hopeful and completely indifferent to human suffering. Tommy wore a suit that didn't quite fit, borrowed from Jack, who'd worn it to exactly one funeral and 3 failed job interviews. Jack sat in the gallery, watching his son answer questions about employment and stability and his fitness as a father. Watched Sarah's lawyer paint a picture of a man consumed by an impractical project, working obsessive hours, gambling his daughter's future on a house that might never be worth more than the debt they'd poured into it. And then Tommy's lawyer, a woman named Rachel who'd offered her services at reduced rate after watching the YouTube channel, called Jack to testify. "Mr. Morrison, you've been working with your son on this renovation. Can you speak to his character?" Jack looked at Tommy, sitting at the defense table with his jaw tight and his eyes wet, and felt 3 generations of Morrison men converge in his throat. "For 30 years, I was a terrible father. I worked too much, cared too little, missed everything that mattered. And my son grew up believing that's what men do. That work comes first. That family is secondary. That showing up is optional." Sarah's lawyer started to object, but the judge waved her quiet. "But over these past 6 months, working on my father's house, I've watched my son become a better man than I ever was. He shows up every day, even when he's exhausted, even when he's broke, even when it would be easier to quit. He shows up for that house, for me, and most importantly, for his daughter." Jack pulled out his phone, opened the Photos app. "Every weekend, Mia comes to the house, and every weekend, Tommy stops whatever he's doing to teach her something. How to measure, how to use a level, how to understand that building something worthwhile takes patience and care, and showing up even when it's hard." He showed the court a photo Tommy didn't know he'd taken, father and daughter, both wearing safety goggles, working on a small wooden box Mia was building as a gift for her mother. The look of concentration on Mia's face, the gentleness in Tommy's hands as he guided hers. "That's the father my son is becoming. Not perfect, but present. And if this court believes that financial stability matters more than that kind of presence, then we've lost sight of what children actually need." The judge studied the photo for a long moment, then looked at Tommy. "Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed your financials. I've seen the YouTube channel. I've read the letters from community members supporting your character. And I've listened to testimony from both sides. This court recognizes that you're in an unconventional situation. But unconventional isn't synonymous with unstable." She paused, and Jack felt the room hold its breath. "I'm granting joint custody, week on, week off, with the stipulation that you maintain stable housing and continue to demonstrate the level of engagement with your daughter that's been documented. Court adjourned." Tommy's face crumpled, relief, gratitude, and exhaustion hitting simultaneously. Jack met him outside the courtroom, and for the first time in 30 years, hugged his son without hesitation or awkwardness. Just held him while Tommy shook with the kind of crying that comes from the bottom of everything. "We won," Tommy said when he could speak. "You won. You showed up. That's all any of us can do." They drove back to Millfield together, to the house that had brought them together and nearly broken them apart. The house that was almost, impossibly, finished. The final 2 months became a blur. Painting, trim work, the thousand small details that transform a construction site into a home. Light fixtures and doorknobs, and the careful installation of Jim Morrison's original hardware, preserved and polished to shine like new. The audience continued to watch. 20,000 subscribers by June, 25,000 by July. The growth was steady, sustainable, the kind that suggested they'd built something with staying power. Not viral fame, something better, something real. In early August, Carol organized what she called the reveal, invited the whole town, set up chairs in the yard, arranged for food and drinks and all the small touches that turn a gathering into an event. Earl helped, and Mrs. Henderson, and dozens of others who'd watched this renovation not just on YouTube but in person, driving by to check progress, offering advice, bringing coffee and donuts on cold mornings. The morning of the reveal, Jack walked through the house alone. Every room now finished, every surface clean, the oak floors gleaming, the walls painted in colors his mother would have chosen. The kitchen functional and beautiful, with the breakfast nook his father had built preserved exactly as it was. In the master bedroom, he found his father's notebook one last time, flipped to the last page where Jim had written a final note dated just weeks before he died. If you're reading this, you came back. I knew you would. Not because I raised you right. I didn't. I worked too much too. Made the same mistakes. But I knew you'd come back because Morrison men always finish what we start. Even if it takes 40 years. The house is yours now. Build something beautiful with it. Not just walls and floors. Build a life, build a family, build something that lasts. Love, Dad. Jack pressed the notebook against his chest and felt his father's presence as real as the walls around him. Felt the weight of 40 years of distance collapse into this single moment of understanding. His father hadn't been perfect, had struggled with the same demons, made the same mistakes, chosen work over presence more times than either of them could count. But he'd built something beautiful anyway, and he'd believed his son could do the same. The crowd gathered at 150 people, maybe more. The whole town, it seemed, plus YouTube subscribers who'd driven from neighboring states to see the ending of the story they had been following for months. Tommy stood on the front porch, Mia beside him, and addressed the assembly with the camera rolling. 7 months ago, my father and I started this project with no money, no plan, and a relationship that was broken in about as many ways as this house. We thought we were renovating a building, but what we were really doing was renovating ourselves. He looked at Jack, standing beside Carol in the front row. My grandfather built this house in 1965. Built it to last. Built it with care and precision and the absolute conviction that quality matters. My father walked away from it, from him, from everything. And I was walking away from my own family, repeating the same pattern, making the same mistakes. Mia tugged on his hand, and Tommy lifted her up so she could see the crowd. But this little girl taught me something. She taught me that showing up matters, that being present is more important than being perfect, that the best thing you can build isn't a house, it's a relationship, a legacy, a life that means something. He set Mia down, walked to the front door, and pulled it open. My grandfather's house, restored, not perfect, but finished, and filled with the work of people who cared enough to help us get here. The crowd moved inside in waves, filling the rooms with voices and laughter, and the sound of people appreciating craftsmanship. They touched the walls, ran hands along the refinished oak, stood in the kitchen, and marveled at how the old and new blended seamlessly. Earl found Jack in his master bedroom, both men standing in the space where Jim Morrison had drawn his last breath. He'd be proud, Earl said simply. I'm not sure I deserve that. None of us deserve most of what we get, good or bad. We just do our best with it. Mrs. Henderson appeared with Mia, the little girl clutching a piece of paper. Mr. Jack, I drew you a picture. Jack knelt, accepting the crayon drawing of a house with 3 stick figures in front. He recognized himself by the gray hair, Tommy by the height, Mia by the pink dress. That's us, she explained unnecessarily. At Grandpa Jim's house. Daddy said we get to live here now. Is that true? Jack looked at Tommy, who nodded. Yes, sweetheart, that's true. Good, I like it here. It smells like wood and paint and home. She ran off to explore, leaving the adults standing in a bedroom that had witnessed birth and death, and now, improbably, resurrection. Tommy pulled an envelope from his pocket. I wanted to show you this before everyone else sees it. Inside was a deed. The house, transferred from Jack's name to Tommy's, with a note in Jack's handwriting. For my son, who taught me how to show up. Build something beautiful. When did you do this? Tommy asked. Last week. Filed it with the county. The house is yours now. Yours and Mia's. I don't need it. Never did. I just needed a reason to work beside you. Jack, Tommy's voice broke on the name. Dad, Jack corrected gently. You can call me Dad now if you want. Tommy folded the deed carefully, precisely, the way their father had taught them to fold anything that mattered. Yeah, I want that. The party continued into evening. The August sun setting late and golden across the yard where Jim Morrison had planted an oak tree 59 years ago. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches providing shade for 3 generations of mistakes and reconciliations. As the crowd thinned, Carol found Jack sitting on the front porch, watching the last light fade. You did good, she said, settling beside him. We did good. Couldn't have done it without you. I know, but you're learning to accept help. That's growth. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind earned through 30 years of knowing someone, through divorce and distance and the slow work of becoming friends after being lovers. What's next for you? Carol asked. I don't know. I'm 58, too old to go back to architecture, too broke to retire, too tired to start over. You could teach. Ohio State has an architecture program. They'd be lucky to have someone with your experience. Someone who got fired for being obsolete. Someone who knows that buildings aren't just structures. They're stories, legacies, proof that someone cared. Jack considered this. Considered the possibility that his failures might contain lessons worth sharing. That his mistakes might prevent younger people from making the same ones. Maybe, he said, maybe I'll try. The last guest left around midnight. Jack and Tommy and Mia sat in the living room, in furniture borrowed from half a dozen neighbors, drinking lemonade and eating leftover cake. Can I sleep here tonight? Mia asked. In the house? It's your week with Mom, Tommy reminded her gently. But it's the house's first night being finished. Someone should be here. Tommy looked at Jack, a question passing between them. Call your mother, Jack said. See if she'll make an exception. Sarah agreed, surprisingly. Said something about wanting Mia to appreciate what Tommy had built. Said it with a warmth that suggested maybe, possibly, some relationships could be repaired even after breaking. They made beds from sleeping bags and couch cushions, told stories about Jim Morrison, about the house being built, about the years when it stood empty, about the months of renovation when it seemed impossible that they'd ever finish. Mia fell asleep between them, small and trusting and completely unaware that she'd saved them both just by existing. Jack carried her to the guest bedroom, the room that had been his childhood bedroom, now restored and painted pink because Mia had requested it. Tucked her in carefully, watching her chest rise and fall with the easy breathing of children who don't yet know the world is difficult. Tommy stood in the doorway watching. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For coming back, for trying, for showing me it's never too late to show up. They stood in the hallway of Jim Morrison's house, 2 men who'd been strangers 7 months ago and were still figuring out how to be family. The house settled around them, creaking and sighing the way old houses do, the sound of something alive and permanent and worth preserving. Your grandfather was right, Jack said finally. The house remembers how it was built, and I think it remembers who we became while building it. Think we became better? I think we became present. That's different. Maybe better. They walked through the finished rooms one last time before bed, turning off lights, checking locks, doing the small rituals of homeownership that Jim Morrison had done for 40 years. In each room, they could see his hand, his vision, his stubborn insistence that quality mattered more than convenience. But they could also see their own work, the repairs they'd made, the problems they'd solved, the arguments they'd had about the right way to do things, and the compromises they'd reached. The house was Jim's vision, but it was their accomplishment, their proof that broken things could be fixed if you cared enough to try on. Jack made a bed on the couch. Tommy took the recliner. Neither could quite believe they were sleeping in a house that 7 months ago had been condemned in all but name. Dad? Tommy's voice in the darkness. Yeah? What do we do now? The house is done. The project's over. What's next? Jack thought about this. About the YouTube channel with its 30,000 subscribers. About the messages from people asking for help with their own renovation projects. About the possibility that they'd stumbled into something larger than saving one house. We help other people save theirs, Jack said. We take what we learned and we teach it. We show people that old houses are worth saving. That craftsmanship matters. That showing up is half the battle. Morrison and Son restoration? Morrison and Son, Jack agreed, has a nice sound to it. They fell silent. Two men in a restored house, planning a future that neither had imagined 7 months ago. Outside, the August night was warm and full of promise. The oak tree rustled in the breeze. Somewhere in the walls, the house settled into itself, secure in the knowledge that it would stand another 60 years. The final video posted a week later. Tommy had edited it with care, showing the full arc from that first day when they'd stood in a gutted kitchen and admitted they had no idea what they were doing, to this moment, 7 months later, standing in a finished home. The video ended with Jack and Tommy and Mia on the front porch, the same porch where Jim Morrison used to sit and watch the world go by, the same porch he'd dreamed about while dying, imagining grandchildren he'd never meet sitting there on summer evenings. "This is my grandfather's house," Mia said to the camera, completely natural, completely unself-conscious. "My daddy and Grandpa Jack fixed it, and now we get to live here and remember great-grandpa Jim every day." The video got 100,000 views in the first week. The comments poured in, stories of people inspired to reach out to estranged family members, of fathers and sons starting their own renovation projects, of old houses saved from demolition because someone watched the Morrison story and decided their house was worth fighting for too. By December, the channel had grown to 75,000 subscribers. Steady, organic growth, the kind that suggested they'd built something with staying power. A production company reached out, interested in turning their story into a series. They politely declined. This wasn't about fame. It was about showing people that redemption is possible, that it's never too late to show up. Jack accepted the teaching position at Ohio State, 2 classes a semester, architecture and ethics, the study of how buildings shape lives and lives shape buildings. He was terrible at it initially, too used to doing instead of explaining. But he improved, learned that teaching is just another form of building, that shaping minds requires the same care as shaping wood. Tommy launched Morrison and Son Restoration with a simple mission: help families save houses that matter. Not for profit, though they'd charge enough to survive, for purpose, for the belief that what you build with care will outlast you. Their first client was Mrs. Henderson. Her Victorian, 3 houses down, needed foundation work and a complete electrical rewiring. They started in September, documenting the process, teaching as they worked. Mia helped on weekends, learning the same lessons her great-grandfather had tried to teach her grandfather 40 years too late. On Christmas, they gathered at the house. Not just Jack and Tommy and Mia, but Carol and Sarah and Earl and Mrs. Henderson and a dozen others who'd helped along the way. The house that Jim Morrison built held them all, warm and solid, and proof that what one man started, others could finish. After dinner, after the presents, after Mia had fallen asleep on the couch clutching the tool belt Jack had made her, Tommy found his father in the master bedroom. "I've been thinking about Grandpa," Tommy said, "about what he'd think of all this." "He'd probably tell us we did it wrong," Jack replied. "Then he'd show us the right way." "No, I think he'd be proud, not of the house, of us, of the fact that we showed up, that we finished what he started." Jack walked to the window, looked out at the yard where snow was starting to fall, covering the world in temporary grace. The oak tree stood tall and dark against the white, exactly as Jim Morrison had envisioned when he planted it 59 years ago. "I spent 40 years running from this place," Jack said quietly. "From him, from everything he tried to teach me. And it turns out the only way forward was back. Back to this house, this town, these values. Everything I thought I'd outgrown. But you came back. That's what matters. We came back, together. I couldn't have done it alone." They stood at the window, father and son, watching snow accumulate on a house that had witnessed 3 generations of Morrison men trying to figure out how to build lives as carefully as they built structures. And in that moment, Jack felt his father's presence, not as a ghost or a regret or a weight, but as a foundation. Solid, permanent, the kind of work that lasts. The house stood around them, every board and nail and carefully placed stone, a testament to the belief that what you build with care will outlast you, that showing up matters, that quality is never an accident, that some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth the sacrifice required to make them whole. Jim Morrison had known that, had tried to teach it, had built a house that would wait 40 years for his son to understand. And now finally and possibly Jack did. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in white. And inside the restored farmhouse on the edge of Millfield, Ohio, 3 generations of Morrison men and the people who loved them celebrated the only holiday that mattered. The holiday of coming home, of finishing what was started, of building something beautiful, of showing up, always finally completely showing up.